Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Enough time has passed, but I still can't forget this story. It has become a part of me, and I have become a part of it. Every night, I dream the same nightmare that drives me insane, forcing me to travel back in time and relive this horror again and again. There were 4 of us, a group of young people in our 30s who remained friends even after finishing college. Me, my girlfriend Emma, who I met in freshman year, Tyler, who had been my buddy since elementary school, and Jessica, his partner. We had one good tradition. Every summer we would go out into nature and set up camping trips. Fortunately, there were plenty of beautiful and scenic places in Colorado, so we never had to think long about where to go. One hot July day, Tyler suggested we head out to an old summer camp called Pine Ridge, deep in the Rocky Mountain forests. As a kid, he used to go there with his parents every summer and knew the route by heart. The journey wasn't short. The place was located in the wilderness, about 25 miles from the nearest town. Thick forests surrounded everything, just the way we liked it. We packed quickly for the road trip, taking some food, various drinks, blankets, and swimming gear. We planned to relax in the sun until evening and then drive back home. Just another summer adventure, if only we had known what this trip would cost us. "Tyler, can you hear me?" "Come in," I said into the walkie-talkie to my friend as I sat behind the wheel. We were driving in 2 cars along a busy highway, Tyler in his truck up front since he knew the way, and me following behind with the girls in my SUV. We were chatting, listening to music on the radio, and just enjoying the moment. "Yeah, Marcus, I hear you perfectly, man. I told you this thing would come in handy. Here we are, out in nature where cell towers don't reach, but we're still connected. Yeah, you were right. Useful gadget. Listen, Tyler, how much longer do we have to drive? Emma's getting hungry, and I could use a snack too." "Not long now. Soon there'll be an exit off the highway. We need to get onto another road, and from there, it's just a stone's throw to the camp. About another 20 minutes, hang in there." "All right, sounds good. What kind of road is it anyway?" "An abandoned highway. It used to be the main route. Everyone used it until they built the new interstate." "Oh, I didn't know that. I've been driving through here for years and always thought this was the only way." "Well, your family just didn't have a car back then, but I was driven on it a lot. There used to be a summer camp by that lake. Cabins were booked weeks in advance. Demand was crazy. But when they closed the road, everything went downhill. Guests stopped coming, and the owners abandoned the business. Now it's all empty, but the place hasn't become any less beautiful because of it. You sure know how to build suspense, buddy. All right, end of transmission. I'm getting tired of talking." Tyler wasn't lying. After about 15 minutes, we really did exit the highway and headed across a field on a dirt road. There wasn't a soul around, giving the impression that no one had driven here for a long time, although the road was fairly fresh and clearly carefully laid out by someone. As soon as we crossed the field, we immediately went deep into the forest, where we soon came across a barrier chain. This was the only obstacle on the way to the nameless highway. We easily overcame it and soon found ourselves on the abandoned interstate. I have to admit, it looked quite menacing. Weeds broke through cracks in the asphalt, and the shoulder was barely visible because of bushes and trees hanging over the road. I also occasionally noticed rusty signs, but even they paled in comparison to an old billboard we came across soon after. It still had an advertisement for that very summer camp, Pine Ridge, with photographs from 20 years ago. The sign was certainly pretty weathered by time, but the text and images on it were visible well enough. After passing the billboard, we turned right after about 100 yards and again left the highway for a dirt road. All that remained was to overcome a section passing through the forest, and the lake would be at our disposal. But then something happened. The thing is, when we were planning the trip, Tyler assured everyone that this place had been abandoned for a long time. He said there was no administration or security guards. But as soon as we approached the camp, a gray-haired, bearded old man came out to meet us. He introduced himself as the watchman. He sat in a makeshift booth and guarded the entrance so that no one would accidentally slip through to the lake without his knowledge. "Good afternoon. Who might you be?" Tyler said, rolling down the passenger window without turning off the engine. He stopped the car near the gate. I followed his example and stopped right behind him. "I'm Old Pete, the security guard here, and you must be our new visitors." "Yes, sir." The old man came almost close to my friend's car and leaned slightly toward the window. "Has the camp been reopened? Everything here has been abandoned for years." "Well, times change. Now there's a new owner who showed up, hired staff. We're slowly fixing everything up like it used to be." "Well, that's good. Why let a beautiful place go to waste? What's the entrance fee?" $25 per person, and you can choose any free cabin. Let me pay for all 4 of us right away. We'll stay until evening." "No problem, go ahead. The administrator will meet you, and you can settle up with her." Saying this, the elderly man approached the gate and opened the entrance for us, after which we finally entered the camp grounds. The place really impressed with its beauty. The lake was quite large and deep, surrounded on 3 sides by dense forest, and closer to us was a beach near which stood summer cabins, just like in a children's camp. Everything was so well maintained and tidy that I would never have called this territory abandoned, at least not now. Tyler was also in mild shock. The last time he came here about 3 years ago, the houses were in completely different condition, and people were rarely encountered here. Mainly these were adventurers like us, who were looking for interesting places to relax. The question of why the new owners needed such an unprofitable business remained open for me, at least for now. As soon as we entered the camp and parked our cars in the clearing, an adult woman named Martha approached us. She introduced herself as the administrator. She informed us about the visiting rules, after which she took payment for admission and provided keys to the furthest cabin. Besides our group and those 2 employees we met, there were at least 7 more people on the camp grounds. Mainly these were rural workers of various ages. Each of them was busy with their own business. Someone was chopping wood and stacking it near the bathhouse, while someone else was doing minor repairs. However, in addition to the working staff, there were surprisingly ordinary guests here too, a married couple, a man and woman in their 40s. Their cabin was next to ours, and they were already relaxing on the beach, clearly having arrived here long before us. Thanks to these folks, We stopped feeling like lonely tourists who had entered someone else's territory. New arrivals, great folks, welcome to Pine Ridge. Make yourselves at home, said the man sitting in a beach chair under an umbrella with a bottle of cold root beer and a bag of chips. His wife was swimming in the water and also waved at us, as if we had been friends for many years. Good afternoon, how's the water? Honestly, I was surprised by such a powerful stream of friendliness. Even the tired workers, seeing us, somehow immediately perked up, despite the fact that it was scorching hot outside and working was torture. Warmer than the ocean. The water may be still, but it's clean. There are springs beating at the bottom. Swimming is pure pleasure. While the girls unpacked things and set the table, Tyler and I stood on the shore and chatted with these nice people. To put it briefly, they learned about this camp by chance. They were driving along the main highway and saw advertising that the new owners had placed. Most likely, this is exactly how they lured their guests, since there was almost no traffic in this place. Well, we were rather an exception. And it seemed like everything was perfect, kind people, warm atmosphere, good summer weather. But very soon our vacation was overshadowed by one incident. Standing on the shore, I turned to the girls at some point to check on them, and suddenly saw this picture. The guy who was chopping wood suddenly stuck his axe into a log and headed toward our ladies, who were cutting vegetables on the porch at that time. Approaching the steps, he first stared at Jessica, then slowly shifted his gaze to Emma while smiling stupidly. The girls stood frozen in place and didn't take their eyes off the stranger, not understanding what he wanted from them. This charming bald man with yellow teeth apparently didn't know about personal space, so I had to rein him in a little. Hey buddy, you got something mixed up. Yeah, I'm talking to you. My shout attracted the attention of almost everyone around, both Tyler and that married couple, and even some of the workers looked in my direction. Only that character to whom it was originally addressed paid no attention to me. Either he was playing dumb, or was too absorbed in the beauty of our companions. Whatever the case, seeing no reaction, I immediately moved in his direction, mentally preparing myself for a fight. And then something curious happened. As soon as I approached this giant and grabbed him by the shoulder, the woman administrator immediately jumped out of the main cabin and barked at her employee. It looked like a teacher in kindergarten scolding a bully who was picking on other children. As if this wasn't an adult man, but a child with mental disabilities. But you know what impressed me more than how the tough guy reacted to my move? I applied enough force to turn the scoundrel to face me, but he stood in place like a rock and didn't even budge. Only after a few moments did he deign to turn around, but already of his own will, after which he stared at me with an insane look. Now, instead of that stupid smile, the psychopath's face showed a snarl that instantly cooled my head. I was no longer sure that I had enough strength to overpower this savage alone. So there was only one thing left. Stand still and look him in the eyes, hoping that everything would work out by itself. And so it happened. The administrator, watching us all this time, shouted out the giant's name, and he looked at her displeasedly. Then he turned around as if nothing had happened and went back to chopping wood. You might think that after this incident we packed our things and went home, but no, this didn't happen. All because of Tyler, who convinced us to stay. I tried to change his mind, but eventually gave up, and there were reasons for that. First, we had traveled too long to get here to just up and leave. In that case, we would have ruined not only our day off, but our mood for the whole week ahead. And second, Manager Martha apologized for her workers' rude behavior and offered us a free stay, returning the money for renting the cabin. This bonus finally overshadowed the unpleasant incident, and we stayed at Pine Ridge to relax and enjoy nature. All the time our group hung out on the beach, I never saw that bald giant who bothered our girls again. Probably they hid him somewhere so he wouldn't scare away all the guests. But here's the dilemma. I couldn't understand the nature of this seemingly adult man's behavior. I couldn't get his impudent smirk and unhealthy attraction to other people out of my head, which is usually only found in psychopaths with sick fantasies. But since this topic was already closed, and I didn't want to spoil anyone's mood, I decided to leave everything as it was and focus on relaxation. The rest of the day until evening we swam and sunbathed, almost never leaving the beach, and only occasionally came to the porch to rest a little from the sun and have a snack. No more strange things happened before our departure, except for one incident in the forest when I wanted to step away for a call of nature. The toilet at the camp was a single wooden outhouse. It was located about 50 yards from the cabins, and you had to walk along a path through the bushes to get to it. I didn't go into the booth itself. I was disgusted. There was such a stench as if someone had fallen into a pit and died. So I had to go a little deeper into the forest. Right there, moving along a well-trodden path. At some point, I stumbled upon a wallet lying in the grass with a full arsenal of cards, a small amount of cash, and a driver's license in the name of one David Miller. I can't say that this find impressed me much. Who knows under what circumstances this item was lost. But what happened next really stressed me out. After some time, someone's footsteps were heard from the direction of our camp. Someone was following right behind me, but it wasn't my friends, since their distant voices were still coming from the beach, which worried me doubly. Soon the figure of the bald giant appeared from the bushes. He was walking toward the toilet, periodically looking back. He saw me, saw that I was going in this direction, and therefore it was not difficult to determine his intention. "Hey, you want to start trouble again? What do you need?" Contrary to common sense, I didn't hide in the bushes but went to meet my opponent. The guy clearly didn't expect such audacity. At first, he just stood there and looked at me, but then suddenly perked up and decided to approach. What happened next is a classic example of misunderstanding between people. I sincerely believed that this person wanted to harm me, and for this reason, I behaved quite aggressively. But it turned out to be completely different. Yes, the man looked like a complete psycho, had an intimidating physical form, and could easily cripple me, but he didn't need to. He wanted to warn us about something, and I understood this immediately after the tough guy stopped a few meters from me and tried to say something. "Go away? What? I don't understand you. You can't. Go away from here." After the man squeezed out a set of slurred sounds from himself and saw that I didn't understand him, he opened his mouth and showed me his cut-off tongue, which caused him speech problems. From the eyes of this good man, it became clear that he didn't wish anyone harm, but on the contrary wanted to warn about something. But about what exactly? "Well, why did you bother the people? Go work. How are we going to heat the bathhouse in the evening?" Unexpectedly, an elderly woman's voice was heard behind. It was Martha. She saw how her ward was following me and decided to control the situation. Apparently, Billy wasn't the most obedient member of their team. Please forgive us, for God's sake. This is my son, my eldest. He's mentally disabled, born that way, unfortunately. Now I have to watch him so he doesn't cause any trouble. It's okay, Martha. I understand everything. We made peace with him and we're not fighting anymore. Yes, Billy. The man ignored my address and turned around, looking guiltily at his mother. The woman ordered him with a stern look to return to the camp, and was about to leave herself when I decided to ask her a question. Excuse me, what happened to his tongue? It seemed to me that it was cut off. How did this happen? Hearing this, the old woman stopped and froze with her back to me, then, still not turning around, said, "He bit it off himself as a child. Sorry, but I wouldn't like to discuss this. All the best." Our strange dialogue ended there, after which we went our separate ways, trying not to catch each other's eyes anymore. During the above events, I completely forgot about the wallet I found, and when I remembered it, we were already packing up and getting ready to go home. Tyler suggested stopping by the police station and giving the find to law enforcement. Everyone supported his idea. Not that anyone didn't trust the local contingent. It was just safer that way. But alas, we couldn't leave this place. When I got in the car with Emma and turned the key in the ignition, the engine wouldn't start, and this was very suspicious, since my car had been diagnosed just a couple of months ago, and the mechanics found no damage. But Tyler's truck, on the contrary, was fine. He and Jessica moved forward, but then saw that I had stalled and stopped too. "So what, are you coming or what?" My friend opened the driver's door and looked at me. Seeing my confused look, he turned off the engine and got out of the car. "Won't start." "Yeah, damn, completely dead. Doesn't even make any sounds. Look." I turned the ignition key again, demonstrating the detected defect to Tyler. "Maybe the battery's acting up." "No, it shouldn't be. I just picked it up from service recently. They said it was like new." "Okay, wait a minute. I'll figure something out now." Tyler headed toward the gate to old Pete, who had been sitting in the guard booth almost all day and hadn't gone anywhere. They talked for a long time about something. My friend even wrote something down on his phone, and then he gratefully nodded to the guard and headed back to me. "So here's the deal. There's no cell service here, can't call a tow truck, unless we get to the nearest town and call from there. It's somewhere about 25 miles north of the camp. I can manage it in about an hour." "Wait, hold on. You're going to drive to town. Am I supposed to stay here alone? Do you have other options? Think about it yourself. We don't have a tow rope. There are no services around either. Only a tow truck remains. I'll fly to the village in no time. Jessica will stay here with you guys. Hang out for another hour or hour and a half. We'll definitely sort everything out before dark. Looking ahead, I'll say right away, no, we didn't sort it out." Tyler left the camp around 6 in the evening, was supposed to return in an hour, but neither by 7, nor by 8, nor even by 9 did he come back. I tried calling him on the walkie-talkie, but nothing worked. Around us was deciduous forest. The communication range was about 4 miles. If my friend had gotten stuck somewhere nearby, I would have heard him. And if he managed to get out to the highway and still hadn't returned, all sorts of bad thoughts started creeping into my head. Could he have been in an accident? And damn, there's no way to even check. The car won't start, there's no connection. The girls also started to worry, especially Jessica. She loved Tyler more than life itself, and couldn't find peace, knowing that he was now somewhere out there in the night, completely alone, possibly faced with the same problem as me. Very soon, alarming hunger set in, as food supplies ran out around 5 o'clock, and now it was getting dark outside, and we should have been home long ago. Honestly, I was surprised by how everyone present reacted to our calls for help. The married couple, for example, had neither a tow rope nor, as they said, spare gas for a trip to town. Remember, only 25 miles. Martha was much more courteous. She offered us to stay at the camp for the night, said she would feed and water us. But when I started asking about her old pickup truck standing in the clearing, the woman didn't even want to talk about this topic. Already then, I had the feeling that everything happening around was part of some insidious plan. But who planned it all, and most importantly, why, was still unclear. By the time it was completely dark outside, the camp staff had built a fire, set up a large spit on which they stuck marinated pieces of meat, and began cooking it over the fire. The three of us were also invited to the picnic to drink tea and have dinner. We couldn't refuse. The air was filled with the smell of roasted meat that drove us crazy and forced us to forget about all problems. Hunger is such a thing. It clouds the mind of any creature and doesn't allow you to concentrate on other needs, except the main physiological one. Almost everyone gathered around the fire. Old Pete the guard, Martha the manager of the whole establishment, 4 men in work clothes who were almost always silent and unquestioningly obeyed Martha, and that married couple. Only Billy was absent, the mentally disabled guy who was naive and simple-hearted like a child. Apparently today he had distinguished himself very much and was now punished by his mother for the rest of the day. Well, guys, maybe you'll tell us how you found our little place. Where did you come from? Rarely does anyone drop by here. We can count guests on our fingers. Old Pete decided to brighten up the wait for delicious dinner, while one of the workers, the younger one, watched the spit, turning it from time to time and making sure the meat didn't burn anywhere. Yeah, Tyler lured us here. This is his parents' favorite place. He says he spent almost his whole childhood here. Tyler, that's the guy who came up to me. Yeah, damn, where did he go? He won't even respond on the radio. Something definitely happened to him. Don't worry so much, Marcus. Everything will be fine. It's summer now. Even if he broke down somewhere, he won't freeze. There aren't many wild animals here. Your friend will calmly spend the night in the car, and tomorrow morning we'll find him, I promise. Michael joined the conversation, the same one who had little gas, no tow rope, and was also afraid they'd find alcohol in his blood after drinking root beer. I didn't answer him, just nodded briefly and continued watching how fat from the already nicely browned meat dripped into the fire. Well, okay, enough bothering them. Can't you see they're not in the mood for you right now? They already have a pile of problems dumped on them. Martha brought us wooden mugs with hot liquid. Fragrant herbs floated inside, and the tea itself was quite tasty, even without sugar. I drained a quarter of the glass at once. Here the barbecue is ready. Dig in, folks, while it's hot. There was quite a lot of meat, enough for our whole group, and even some left over. Old Pete cut the pieces so they looked like decent-sized steaks, and we started eating them with such appetite that we didn't even notice how everyone gathered was watching us intently. The taste of the meat was somehow unusual, not like regular barbecue. Not pork, little fat, juicy, literally melted in your mouth. Maybe lamb. Although no, we had just recently ordered it at a cafe, the taste was completely different. I continued chewing and swallowing piece after piece, while gratefully smiling at the people sitting opposite. They watched with curiosity for some more time how we ate, and then also started the meal. Well, guys, guess from 3 tries what kind of beast this is. I caught it myself. I love hunting. It's my hobby. The old man's eyes sparkled with dark merriment. The expression on his face in the firelight seemed especially ominous. Wow, you caught it yourself. Must be wild boar. Emma put forward her assumption, but the old man just smiled slyly and shook his head negatively. No, any more guesses? Well, there's a lot of meat here. Maybe it's some kind of elk, Jessica said, pleasantly chomping over her plate. Good try, but also no. One guess left. Maybe the young man will try his luck. Well, I don't even know. If it's not elk and not boar, who else could live in this forest? And then I was struck with chills. I cast a fleeting glance at the spit, where the second batch of barbecue was finishing cooking, and saw something that almost made me sick. On one of the pieces of flesh, a slightly baked fragment of a drawing was visible, a black skull with 2 crossed leg bones. This was Tyler's tattoo. He had it inked on his left leg, and we chose the design together right in the salon with the artist. You can't even imagine what was going on inside me at that moment, when I finally realized everything happening around. My gaze immediately began darting anxiously around the group of cannibals gathered by the fire, each of whom was greedily chewing meat, while drool flew in all directions. Only Martha and the old man maintained deathly calm, not taking their eyes off me. Oh, I see you figured it all out. Well, how do you like your buddy? Not too raw. As soon as he said this, everyone around, even that married couple who pretended to be guests, burst into laughter in unison, after which the old witch decided to speak up too. That's enough mockery. Give them a chance to finish eating properly, or look how skinny they are. Hearing this, I wanted to get up and kick these impudent freaks in the teeth who took advantage of our naivety and difficult situation. But alas, my body wouldn't obey me. My legs and arms were like cotton, and my vision blurred as if the 3 of us had been heavily drugged. Emma and Jessica were already lying on the ground. Next to them lay pieces of half-eaten meat and empty mugs with unknown herbs. I tried to resist for some more time, but soon I too couldn't stand it and plunged into darkness. I opened my eyes already in some remote clearing in the middle of the forest. It was still deep night outside. The moon shone so brightly as if it were some kind of spotlight. Thanks to it, you could make out every blade of grass on the ground. But these clowns, for some reason, decided to place torches everywhere. Probably they wanted to impress us, and they succeeded. I came to from the girls screaming my name and calling for help. They were very frightened, and this was understandable. We had been kidnapped by a gang of some villagers who also liked to eat human flesh. What was going on in their minds, only God knew. Although judging by what I saw a little later, they clearly didn't believe in him. The 3 of us were tightly tied to wooden posts driven into the ground. I was in the middle, Emma to my left, Jessica to my right. The company of kidnappers in full assembly stood in a semicircle about 15 feet from us. They were all whispering something under their breath, and were dressed in dark cloaks with hoods under which it was hard to make out anything. The situation around resembled some satanic ritual where we were the victims. Red liquid had been used to draw some circles and incomprehensible symbols on the grass. and right in the center stood a large old stump with an axe stuck in it. This explained why we were still alive. They weren't lying somewhere in a refrigerator, divided into several parts. As soon as the cannibals saw that we had regained consciousness, one of them, the one standing on the right, stepped forward a little and removed his hood. It was that same old woman who had given us tea. Most likely, she was the leader of the sectarians, although I never managed to fully understand their hierarchy. My children, let us thank the Father for sending us this glorious food. Let us show that his gifts are valuable to us. Choose who we will send to him first. After the old hag said this, all the Satanists almost simultaneously pointed their finger at me, after which the healthiest of them moved in my direction. I recognized him almost immediately. It was Billy, the man suffering from mental disability. He was playing the role of executioner, and in dark robes with a machete in his hands, he looked especially terrifying. But as it often happens, a person's appearance turned out to be deceptive. Approaching me, the giant took off his hood and looked at me. His eyes showed sorrow and anguish. He was sincerely sorry for me, and probably for many others before us. Judging by the fact that his tongue was cut off, I even guess by whom exactly. Soon the executioner untied the rope that bound my hands, then grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and dragged me to that very stump. I had no strength to resist this giant. My arms and legs still felt weak after the poison. We drank sitting by the fire. Having brought me to the execution site, the man laid my head on a piece of cut tree, having previously replaced his weapon with an axe. At that moment, I no longer paid attention to the crying girls who begged them to spare us, nor to the owl's cries coming from somewhere in the forest. I wanted to end all this crap called life as soon as possible. Come on, my son, fulfill the will of our Father. Finish off the bastard so we can sprinkle this sacred field with his blood. And then the situation took an unexpected turn. Granny didn't manage to finish what she wanted to say, because at that very moment, the giant, instead of executing me, turned around and took off the old witch's head. Let's say he wrote her a ticket to the beloved father she so admired. Then absolutely everyone freaked out: me, Emma, Jessica, and even those ghouls who until now had been standing in a semicircle and silently staring at what was happening. It seemed that time around had stopped, and only the old man's scream could bring everyone back to reality. You son of a bitch, get him. At that moment, fate gave me a chance that simply couldn't be wasted. I quickly assessed the situation and realized that fighting against 7 sectarians armed with machetes, even with such a trump card at hand as Billy, was suicide. Therefore, I made the only right decision to save our lives. The girls were still chained to the posts, and as soon as the pack of cannibals rushed at our savior, I ran to free them. Luckily, Billy's machete was lying nearby, with which I could easily cut the ropes, after which the 3 of us rushed toward the forest. Already running up to the thicket, I turned around for a second to check if anyone was chasing us, and saw something that made my heart involuntarily clench. The Satanists were cutting the man up in a crowd, though not as numerous as before. Before dying, the hero managed to take at least 3 non-humans with him to the next world. For this, eternal honor and gratitude to him. Our rescue plan was as follows. I planned to get lost among the trees, then try to get out to the highway and call someone for help. But it turned out to be not so simple. The thing is, we had no landmarks. plus the tree crowns almost completely blocked the moonlight, because of which we moved practically by touch, holding each other's hands so as not to get lost in the darkness. We never managed to get out to the saving highway. As it turned out later, it was in a completely different direction. But this didn't matter. We continued to stubbornly go forward, and after some time, we came across a camp of tourists who, to our great luck, decided to go hiking that day. The three of us managed to survive, but at what cost? Tyler was killed and eaten, and we participated in the latter, even though no one suspected what it was. They found his car with punctured tires right at the entrance to Pine Ridge. My friend didn't even manage to reach the abandoned highway before they ambushed him and brutally killed him, then butchered him like cattle and served him for dinner. From 7 to 9 o'clock, I tried to contact an already dead person on the walkie-talkie, not even realizing how close he was to me. As for the camp, it was almost completely destroyed by fire. Even that unfortunate wooden toilet was burned down, under which they later found half-rotted human remains. The surviving cannibals tried to cover their tracks, and unfortunately, they succeeded. Apparently, they went into the forests, since no one has ever seen them since then. By the way, about the wallet, David Miller, the same man whose license I found, was listed among the missing persons. On Saturday morning, he left for fishing and never returned home. He was far from the only one who got lost in these places, but all of them, for obvious reasons, still remain unfound. The ritual clearing was only a few hundred yards from the camp. It was also set on fire, along with the bodies that remained lying charred on the ground, next to the bloodied stump. I'm still tormented by the question of what kind of secret society this was, and how we could have run into them. But one thing I understood for sure: remote forests hide many dangers and secrets, and any seemingly harmless hike can turn into serious problems. Just be careful and take care of yourselves. The music faded as everything began to fall apart. I lost my job in the city, and there were no other options. The bills kept piling up, and I didn't know where to turn. But then I saw this ad in the local paper: security guard needed for remote site. Room and board provided. High pay. Rotation schedule. It sounded too good to be true, but I was desperate. I was ready to go anywhere just to make some money. That's how it all started. When I called the number, a man answered. He introduced himself as Frank Coleman. His voice was rough and tired, like he'd been smoking for decades. Without much small talk, he invited me for an interview that same evening. We met at a truck stop diner on the outskirts of town. Coleman turned out to be a gruff man in his 50s with weathered features. He briefly explained the job to me. I needed to guard an old abandoned iron mine with the curious name Iron Ridge Mine. 1 week there, 1 week home. The task was simple: keep looters away so they wouldn't strip the equipment for scrap metal. The pay was decent because of the isolation and boredom. He mentioned the cave-in that killed the miners only in passing, like it was just an unfortunate accident due to safety violations. I could tell he didn't want to dwell on the subject, and I didn't press him with questions. As long as they paid on time, the rest didn't matter much to me. Just a couple of days later, we headed out in an old pickup truck that looked like it was about to fall apart. The drive took about 2 hours. First, we drove on the highway, then turned off onto a dirt road. We passed through forests and fields, saw abandoned villages with houses that had sunk into the earth. There used to be a mining settlement here, Frank told me. Life was bustling like a river, but then they decided to seal up Iron Ridge Mine, and this place turned into a dead zone. He told me all this while we bounced over potholes, kicking up dust from the road. He smoked one cigarette after another, listened to music on an old radio, and kept talking about something or other. I tried to respond, but most of the time I rode in silence, smiling reluctantly at my companion. "Almost there," the driver muttered after the truck shook from hitting another pothole. "Don't worry, Jake. The place is remote but peaceful. The previous guy was a bit off, couldn't handle the silence. Nervous type, probably didn't like being alone." As soon as he said that, a clearing appeared through the trees, and we finally reached the site. It was surrounded by a rusty fence and consisted of a large clearing next to a hill where you could see the entrance to the mine. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary dark cave reinforced with wooden beams. Inside, on rusty rails, stood weather-beaten mine carts and long-dead lanterns hung from the ceiling. It was a perfectly ordinary place, if you didn't consider that somewhere deep underground, 15 people had died. As for the site itself, closer to the gates was a construction trailer that looked like a forgotten container. There was also a gas generator and a portable toilet with an outdoor sink. Everything was minimal, just like in the army. Nothing extra, everything strictly by necessity. After Coleman opened the gates, we drove inside the site. I was happy to leave the vehicle because my rear end had almost turned square after the 2-hour bumping, and I wanted to stretch a bit. "Well, here are your apartments," the man said, getting out after me and nodding toward the trailer. "Inside there's a space heater, a bed, a table, everything you need. I brought you food for a week with extra. Canned goods, grains, water in those containers over there. I'll start up the generator now. Just don't turn it off. There's enough gas, it should run constantly for light and for noise. The silence here is oppressive." Frank somehow mysteriously looked around the entire territory, stopping his gaze on the mine for a moment, then moved to the trunk and began unloading boxes of food. "There's not much to do here. Do your rounds from time to time, check the fence. Main thing is to make sure nobody goes into the mine. It's sealed off, dangerous in there. They'll pick you up next Saturday morning. There's no phone service here, so you're on your own, but nothing will happen. Just sit tight and earn your money. All right, I'm heading out. Good luck." With those words, the man jumped into his pickup, turned around, and drove off. The sound of the engine faded, and silence crashed down on me. Only the generator rattled and the trees rustled. I was alone. I spent the first half of the day setting up my new living space. I moved the food supplies into the trailer, unpacked my personal belongings, and made the bed with clean sheets. Inside, the trailer turned out to be even smaller than it looked from outside, probably because of the old, bulky furniture that took up most of the space. Against the wall opposite, the entrance stood a 2-door cabinet. By the window was a wooden chair with a writing desk, and in the right corner was a spring bed with a mattress that had some dark stains on it. The room smelled musty, like nobody had been in it for a long time. Although Frank had supposedly said they took my replacement away this past Saturday. So he lied, but why? A decent layer of dust on the table and windowsills confirmed my suspicions, but there was nobody left to ask. The supervisor had left without giving me a radio or anything else to communicate with the outside world. I faced a whole week of solitude in this wilderness, alone with my thoughts. At the time, I saw it as a test of fate. Could I step out of my comfort zone, live without internet, computer games, hanging out with friends, and so on? After all, it was only for a few days, and then I could return to normal life. On the first night, I did 2 rounds with a flashlight. I didn't notice anything strange, though I'll admit I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The beam of light only caught the rusty chain-link fence, behind which you could dimly see the dark forest. As for the mine, there was nothing to say. I was too scared to even approach it, let alone shine the flashlight into the cave and try to see something in there. Returning to the trailer, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. I listened to every rustle, a branch would crack, an owl would hoot, but these were ordinary forest sounds that didn't frighten me at all. I was used to them. I only fell asleep toward morning. On the second day, boredom began to set in. Time dragged on endlessly. I wandered around the territory, tugged at the lock on the gates, studied the inside of the cave. To keep myself occupied somehow, I decided to tidy up the little house. Since yesterday, I had neither the strength nor the mood for it. And at some point, rummaging through a pile of junk, I accidentally came across one curious item, a thick notebook with a black cover on which someone had written in beautiful, almost calligraphic handwriting. Observation log and duty records, Iron Ridge mine site. I chuckled. So Coleman was apparently a bureaucracy lover, making the guards keep reports. I wondered what they even wrote about here. With these thoughts, I opened the journal and flipped through several pages. Everything was quite standard, several columns with dates, times, and guard observations. June 3rd, started shift at 9 a.m. Site secure. Generator fueled. No trespassers. June 4th, rained during the night. Fence undamaged. Territory inspected at 11:30 p.m. No trespassers. June 5th, refueled generator. Nothing new. And so on, complete boredom. I was about to toss the journal back when I suddenly noticed a small bookmark in the form of a folded sheet. This was the idea of one of the guards. He wanted to leave a message for his colleagues, and was clearly trying to do it secretly, probably afraid that management would throw out the notebook and new employees would be left in the dark. Hey there, I don't know your name, but if you're reading this, I have bad news for you. You're in deep trouble, buddy, and to make it to next Saturday, you'll have to follow certain rules. Yeah, nobody told you about this when you got hired, but I'll be honest, few people know the real situation. Management couldn't care less about what goes on in this hole, and former guards prefer not to come back here. And you know what? I can understand them. I'm one of the few who lasted at this post for more than a month. Maybe my curiosity will kill me someday, but I can't help myself. I'm like a fish in water here now, so I advise you to listen to me. Reading this passage, I fell into a stupor. It was scary, but at the same time, curiosity was tearing me apart. Turning the page, I saw numbered points, a list of recommendations for newcomers. Read this carefully. This is not a joke. Rule number 1, never turn off the generator at night, even if it seems too loud. Silence is what it's waiting for. Noise scares it away. Rule number 2, the mine comes alive sometimes. You'll hear sounds from it scraping metal, the sound of pickaxes, quiet voices. Don't believe it. There's nobody there. Nobody alive anyway. It's an echo of the tragedy, a lure. The closer you get to the cave, the louder and clearer the sounds become. Don't give in. Rule number 3. If you hear a long howl from the forest, know that it's not wolves. It's hungry and has come out to hunt. Don't go outside. Just sit quietly and don't interfere. Rule number 4. If the lights go out at night and the generator stops, under no circumstances should you leave the trailer. Don't approach the windows. Don't light your flashlight. Lock the door, hide, and don't make a sound. It will be nearby, checking how vigilant you are. This thing only fears daylight. Wait for morning. Rule number 5. If you hear knocking on the door in the middle of the night and voices, don't open it and don't answer under any circumstances. This is its most terrible trick. It knows about your presence, but can't enter without an invitation. And remember, this creature loves to play with human emotions. It enjoys when you torment yourself, when you're afraid, waiting for dawn and hoping for a miracle. Don't give it what it wants. For the first few days, the entity will get used to you, studying your habits and behaviors. You might not notice this, but I advise you not to show yourself around the mine unnecessarily, especially at night. P.S. If you don't believe me, turn the page and read the newspaper clipping. It will help shed light on what happened to those poor miners. Small spoiler, it wasn't a cave-in. The stranger wasn't lying. On the next page was indeed a yellowed, carefully cut, rectangular piece of newspaper. The article's headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance of Crew at Iron Ridge Mine." The article said that many years ago, an entire shift of miners working on the lowest level had vanished without a trace. There was no cave-in, no methane explosion. The rescuers who went down found working equipment, personal belongings, and even half-eaten lunches, but they never found the workers' bodies. Soon, the investigation hit a dead end. As a result, the mine was closed and sealed. Nobody went there anymore. Seeing this article, I slammed the journal shut. A chill ran down my spine as if I'd been doused with ice water. In that moment, I tried to convince myself that this was someone's cruel joke. Maybe Coleman decided to mess with me like this, or my predecessor was so bored that he made up this frightening legend. However, it was very difficult to get rid of the sticky, disgusting feeling of anxiety. I spent the rest of the day in a fog. I wanted to distract myself from dark thoughts, but for some reason kept returning to that strange message. The rational part of me insisted, "Jake, you're a grown man. Don't fall for this nonsense. Some psycho decided to mess with you, and you fell for it like a child." But another, emotional part whispered that in such a remote place, anything could happen, and I needed to be on guard. Very soon, I caught myself constantly listening to the generator's operation. Its rattling, which had previously been annoying, now seemed like saving music. Either I was already starting to go slowly crazy from loneliness, or I really believed that silence could destroy me. Whatever the case, nothing suspicious happened that day or that night. Yes, I felt someone's foreign gaze on me when I went out to check the territory, but I thought it was just suggestion. Apparently, rationalism prevailed over emotions, which allowed me to calm down a bit and put my thoughts in order. The first strange things began on Wednesday. On this day, the sky was covered with a gray shroud. You couldn't hear birds singing, animals rustling, or even the sound of wind breaking through the trees. In the evening, when it was already getting dark, I was sitting by the window drinking tea when I suddenly caught a barely audible scraping of iron, as if something heavy and sharp was being dragged across the ground. I froze and listened, silence. Did I imagine it? I thought to myself, and immediately heard a new sound. This time it was clearer metal against stone, like the strike of a pickaxe. The noise was coming from the mine. Someone was clearly in there, and it seemed like this someone was trying their best to get my attention. With each minute, the sounds grew louder and louder. Someone was dropping heavy objects, moving mine carts, and then out of nowhere decided to play a harmonica. The melody was simple, mournful, and kept breaking off as if the player couldn't remember the tune. But this was still nothing compared to what began after. In an instant, I heard terrible whispering voices. They begged for help, screamed, called to me. "Help us, it's cold here. Water, please, water. Jake, can you see us?" As soon as I heard my name, my heart began pounding frantically, and a lump rose in my throat. I wanted to run out of the trailer and scream for them all to shut up. But then the second rule flashed in my head. The closer you get to the mine, the louder and clearer the sounds become. Don't give in. Pulling away from the window, I drew the curtain, then locked all the locks, lay down on the bed, and covered myself with a blanket. It was that night that I understood everything written in that journal wasn't a prank, but a real survival guide. The hardest part was waiting for morning. Thursday was rainy. The downpour drummed on the metal roof without stopping, almost drowning out the noise of the generator. I got used to waking up only in the evening, since I couldn't sleep at night. The evil showed itself exclusively during dark hours. Today was no different. Everything started around midnight when I heard a long howl. It came from the direction of the forest, but these weren't wolves. I knew how they howled. This was something conscious, terrible longing turning into a threat. Rule number 3, it's not a beast. It's hungry and has come out to hunt. Sit quietly and don't interfere. Everything came down to me having to stay in the trailer, and under no circumstances leave it. Of course, it's easy to say, but much harder to do, especially when you understand that there's some unknown thing outside that clearly doesn't wish you well. Every time I felt the presence of this creature, I wanted to run outside and bolt into the forest, to get lost somewhere in the wilderness just to not feel its sticky gaze on me. It was an endless battle between mind and emotions. Only one thing saved me, the hope that this would end someday. The cherished pickup would arrive, and I'd speed away from here, forgetting everything like a bad dream. If only I could make it to Saturday. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard the steady hum of the generator begin to falter. It suddenly choked and died, causing the light bulb in the trailer to flicker and go out. The room plunged into complete darkness, but the silence frightened me more. It pressed on my ears and was almost tangible. Even the sound of rain beating on the roof couldn't dispel it. Rule number 4. Panic overwhelmed me. The first idea that came to mind was to run outside to the generator, start it up, bring back the light and saving noise. I jumped up, found my flashlight in the dark, and stepped toward the threshold. And then, like a flash in my brain, under no circumstances should you go outside. My hand recoiled from the cold door handle as if burned. I had checked the generator during the day. There was more than half a tank of gas. It couldn't just die like that. They did this on purpose to lure me out of my shelter. So the trailer had turned from a refuge into a trap. Slowly on tiptoe, trying not to make a sound, I backed into the farthest corner, then sat on the floor and hugged my knees. Don't approach the windows. Don't light your flashlight. I managed to see it completely by accident, when the moon peeked out from behind the clouds for a second. Its pale light was enough to make out a dark silhouette in the window. It didn't look like an animal. Rather, it was condensed darkness, a black mist vaguely resembling a human figure. Where its face should have been, two whitish fires burned. The thing stood outside and greedily peered into the trailer space, pressing black palms against the glass. A deathly cold emanated from it. For a second, it even seemed like my breath was visible, as if the temperature inside my little room had dropped below freezing. It was looking for me, and it seemed we even made eye contact a couple of times, but this didn't lead to any consequences. After standing by the window for a bit, the entity pretended not to notice anyone, then silently withdrew and melted into the night. Friday night turned out to be the most difficult and terrifying. Probably because the demons of the mine understood this was their last chance to cloud my mind and drag me into their trap. Therefore, events developed very rapidly. This time there were no preludes. No sooner had the sun disappeared behind the horizon than I immediately felt the familiar cold. In the same second, the generator that had been running smoothly all day died, and the light bulb overhead went out. It was approaching. And then I heard a loud, but at the same time human, almost polite knock on the door. Then a voice came from outside, the voice of Frank Coleman. "Hey Jake, come on, open up. What are you doing locked up in there? Are you afraid of mosquitoes or something? Why isn't the generator working? When did you last fuel it?" At that moment, I was filled with mixed feelings. I was glad to hear a truly living human voice for the first time in a long while, but at the same time, I was plagued by doubts. Why would my supervisor come to such a remote place in the middle of the night just to check how I was doing? Nonsense. And why didn't I hear the sounds of a car approaching the gates? Maybe because this was another bluff, and there were no living people on the other side of the door. "Jake, did something happen in there? Maybe you'll open up and we can talk." And then I caught myself thinking once again that if it weren't for that journal with the black cover, I would probably have been dead long ago. It turns out one person's initiative saved another's life, maybe even more than one, because apparently the turnover at this place was quite high, which is why management had to keep quiet about many things and completely hide others. While I was lost in my thoughts, the monster decided to change tactics. Now, it began copying the voice of a small boy who had somehow gotten lost in the wilderness, where it was difficult to reach even by car. "Mister," came a thin, crying child's voice from behind the door. "Mister, please let me in. I'm lost. I'm cold and scared." Honestly, if I hadn't read those notes, I would have rushed to the door long ago. The demon spoke so pitifully and pleadingly that I really wanted to let it inside. However, at that moment, rule number 5 pulsed in my head. If you hear voices, don't open and don't answer under any circumstances. I sat on the floor by the bed. The feeling of complete despair and hopelessness didn't leave me for a second. Memories of family and loved ones played in my head. I was afraid that I would never see them again, and all the problems that had pursued me until this day now seemed insignificant. Money, to hell with it. I'd earn more, pay off the debts, if only I could live until that damn Saturday. For some more time, the thing tried to make me feel sorry for it. But then, apparently realizing this wasn't working, it decided to resort to extreme measures. The childish notes disappeared, and from that same throat came something low and rumbling, like the devil from hell trying to speak human words. "Open the door." Its voice had a commanding, threatening tone. It was breaking in, no longer hiding its intentions. "You can stop hiding. I'm coming in anyway. Open up." In the same second, a powerful blow struck the door, making the whole trailer shudder and small objects fall from the table. Then I sincerely didn't understand why, having such monstrous strength, it simply didn't break this flimsy trailer in half and drag me outside. Could it really not enter without an invitation? I tested this theory throughout the night, listening to the entity roar, scratch the metal with its claws, and race around the little house, vainly trying to reach me. Sometimes it would change its approach, calling me by name in the voices of my parents or brother. Then again the child's crying, and so on in circles, until at one wonderful moment everything fell silent, and the first rays of sun began to break through the window. The saving dawn had come. As promised, my contract ended on Saturday morning when they picked me up from this hell and took me back to the city, to saving civilization. It wasn't Coleman who came for me, but another man who, like me, had been hired recently. He had no idea what kind of place this was and didn't believe a single word I said. He looked at me like I was crazy, and I understand. I wouldn't have believed myself if I hadn't seen what I saw. By the way, they paid me the money, and I'll tell you, it wasn't small. They even offered me another week, but I told them where to go. Life is worth more than dirty paper that can lose its value at any moment. As for that entity, I tried to dig up any information about it on the internet, but unfortunately, apart from the article about the missing miners, I found nothing. I have a personal theory that this monster was accidentally unearthed in the depths of the cave, after which a series of mysterious disappearances began. And they send guards there because some unnamed businessman decided to buy this mine and restore work on extracting useful resources. So to speak, revive Iron Ridge Mine. I really hope he doesn't succeed. I wouldn't want to see new headlines where missing people are mentioned. My name is Ethan Harrington, and I never thought my job as a truck driver would ever put me in this situation I'm about to describe. It was an ordinary day like any other, and my route took me across California from the vibrant city of Los Angeles to the mystical redwoods up north. The sun had already begun to disappear behind the horizon when I pulled up to a sleepy truck stop for some much-needed rest. With my back throbbing from hours at the wheel, I hopped out of my cab, eager to stretch my legs. When I heard a loud crack nearby, like the snapping of bones, a shiver ran through me as my headache suddenly seemed so insignificant. In an instant, the lot fell silent. Inspecting around cautiously, I glanced at the other drivers, who had also stopped their conversations mid-sentence, each one of us scanning the area uneasily. We laughed nervously and brushed it off as someone dropping something sizable. Still uneasy about the sound, I reassured myself, thinking that perhaps it was just firewood being split at one of the nearby campsites. After all, nothing sinister had ever happened in this neck of the woods before, right? There's never a dull day on this job, I joked with another driver as we entered the diner attached to the truck stop for food and shelter. Bizarrely, that oddly loud sound somehow drew us closer together, strangers in solidarity. Laughter came easily as we traded stories over coffee and questionable lasagna, before eventually heading out into the night again with palpable reluctance. But one sound led to another. The cacophony of small animals scuttling across hidden paths grew sudden and tense. An unknown weight filled our steps even after we left our newfound acquaintances inside. As I clambered back into my truck cab, with recitations of drive safe ringing shallow in my ears, my gut instinct held me back from starting the engine. My breathing turned shallow in the silent darkness as it gradually intensified into a feeling of impending doom. It took me only a moment to decide that I couldn't just sit there, unprotected and helpless, so I fumbled around in my glove box for my weathered pocket knife. Something sinister lurked at the edge of my peripheral vision, a bit further down the row of trucks and trailers. Though I could only see a blur, whoever they were, either moved nor spoke. And while it's easy to rationalize away fear, somehow that shadow felt impossibly bone-chillingly wrong. One of them stepped from between the shadows cast by a row of tires on a parked truck and began moving towards me, slow and deliberate. From the fleeting appearance, I discerned odd angled limbs, but had no time to process as I fumbled with the knife in my trembling hands. In an instant, two more joined their partner. They moved with unwavering purpose and frightening speed. Now that our eyes had met, my heart was pounding wildly as my fingers finally gripped the handle of the knife. Just as I stood from my seat to lock the cab door, a fourth figure appeared. This one taller than the others, and I knew there was no further room for escape or denial. These twisted shadows weren't just illusions triggered by exhaustion. They were deadly real, and they were coming for me. Desperation filled me as I briefly considered trying to start up my truck and flee this nightmare before it reached me. But even if my hands weren't shaking violently, or if they didn't seem so impossibly swift, I couldn't hide anymore. Nowhere to run disconnected me from reality. One thing was certain: leaving myself exposed seemed like an even worse decision. Once again, the tallest of the assailants raised their hand towards me, as if beckoning me forth like a fisherman baiting his prey. Thoughts raced through my mind aimlessly, struggling to settle on some misguided plan of action. Before I could even take a breath to brace myself, an unexpected explosion of screaming broke the blackened air around me. The sudden scream came from Samantha, a waitress from the diner. She had ventured out into the night to take a break and smoke a cigarette, completely unaware of what was unfolding. She stared in terror at the approaching figures, fully aware that whatever was happening was not something she wanted any part of. Her screams seemed to stall the figures momentarily. Taking this opportunity, I quickly unlocked my truck door and took refuge in the cab. The other drivers hurriedly scrambled into their own trucks, everyone realizing they should be getting as far away from these beings as possible. Knowing that it would be too risky to start up my engine and try to drive away, I opted instead to place a call for help. I dialed 911 and attempted to explain the situation to the dispatcher in terse and urgent terms. They promised they'd send help right away and instructed me to stay where I was. Details of uniform-like garb began to come into focus, and though it was difficult to see their faces, I recognized them as dangerous individuals, perhaps part of a violent or even murderous gang. Minutes went by that felt like hours. The tension in the air was thick, and every second seemed endless. I hoped that law enforcement would arrive soon, but it seemed more likely that they wouldn't reach us in time. My fear grew exponentially when I saw these figures approaching Samantha. Their intentions were evidently less than benign, leaving me with no choice but to intervene. Gathering my courage, I burst from the safety of my truck cab with the pocket knife clenched firmly in hand, cutting through the cold darkness towards where they held Samantha captive. I shouted at them in an attempt to divert their attention. The ruckus attracted some other drivers who joined me in saving Samantha. Their presence lent me additional strength. We formed an alliance against these nefarious invaders as adrenaline surged through our veins. Upon seeing their friend in danger, we engaged in an improvised yet desperate battle. Our efforts appeared to be working. They hesitated, trying to weigh whether continued assault was worth the risk. The sight seemed to unsettle all four of them. Suddenly, sirens pierced through the night. It was as if divine intervention had answered our plea. Police cars skidded onto the scene, throwing dust and gravel in their wake. Samantha managed to break free from their grasp, making her way towards us and the safety of the arriving officers. The armed gang members immediately took off into the night like animals fleeing from a predator. The officers gave chase, but ultimately were unable to apprehend them. We stood there as the triumphant heroes, though we couldn't shake a sinking feeling that this was not over yet. One of the truckers who had helped me during the scuffle was an Army veteran proficient in recognizing badges and insignia. He identified the attackers as part of a vicious criminal cartel led by Razor Gregory, known for his particularly brutal and ruthless methods. It became clear to me that we had merely won a battle and not the war. As police took our statements about the incident and ensured Samantha's safety, we couldn't help but glance nervously over our shoulders. Indeed, at any moment we expected retaliation. However, days passed without incident. Life resumed its normal course, with no interference from our assailants. We knew better than to let our guard down completely, though. Razor Gregory and his gang remained active in their pursuit of chaos and violence elsewhere in California. As I resumed my job as a truck driver, haunted by those gruesome images at the back of my mind, one thought remained clear. They were still out there, and somehow we knew they would be back. In this never-ending cycle of violence and retribution, which didn't feel satisfying whatsoever, my life became forever tinted with uncertainty and a newfound vigilance, leaving me wondering every day if it had been my last. During a routine stop at the Smoky Point Rest Area in Arlington, Washington, I couldn't help but notice how unusually quiet everything seemed. Even the wind in the trees seemed to hold its breath as I stepped out of my truck, stretching my stiff limbs. There was something particularly unsettling about the heavy silence that enveloped me. I shook off the creeping unease and strode toward the restroom building, eager for some semblance of normalcy. While washing my hands at a cracked sink, I struck up a conversation with Morris Powell, another trucker who was recently let go from his previous job. We quickly realized we had a lot more in common than just our line of work. Our mutual love for one-liners soon found us sharing jokes and laughing at our own silliness. "You know they say laughter's contagious," Morris said through chuckles. "I guess that's true since we're both infected." As our laughter died down, I noticed something through the grimy restroom window. A man standing near my truck. He looked unnervingly ordinary as he nonchalantly rummaged through one of the storage compartments on the side of the trailer. "Hey," I shouted as Morris, and I stepped outside to confront him. The man didn't budge or even acknowledge our presence. We approached cautiously when suddenly his head snapped around to face us, revealing eyes that held nothing but malice and an all-consuming hunger for dread. He stared right into my soul as if it were a feast laid out before him. Simultaneously repulsed, yet unable to look away. Either Morris nor I could manage much more than stammering in confusion and horror. The man, still unflinching in his lock on my gaze, began peeling back his lips to reveal teeth that looked like they belonged more to a carnivorous animal than a human. Morris managed to break free from the man's hold. "Jake, we need to call for help." His urgency snapped me back to reality. "My phone's in my truck. You see if there's a landline inside." Morris ran back into the restroom while I dashed to the truck driver's side door and fumbled with my keys. Fear was a heavy weight in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. As I finally managed to retrieve my phone, glancing back at the man just as he tore through the last piece of metal separating him from the contents of my truck, I punched in 911, but there was only silence on the other end. No reassuring click of someone responding to help. As I shut the door and sprinted back toward Morris, my heart pounding and hands clammy with terror-fueled sweat, the man kept his focused, malicious gaze on me. But now, he moved closer with a deliberate stride, clearly enjoying the sick power play his presence had instilled. Morris joined me just as the nightmare-inducing figure stepped even closer. He had pulled something out of my truck, a long, rusted chain that he dragged behind him with cruel intent. The glint in his eyes sharpened as he caught sight of Morris, and without hesitation or warning, he slammed his hand against Morris's head with force unimaginable. Howling screams tore from Morris's throat at a pitch that would haunt me for eternity if I survived this ordeal. The twisted grin on that flesh-craving fiend's face only seemed to widen when witnessing our shock and dismay. With Morris writhing in agony on the ground, the gravity of our situation was abundantly clear. Neither of us had any means to adequately fight back against this monstrous attacker. I decided that despite my own immense dread, I couldn't leave my newfound friend suffering. Grabbing the nearest blunt object I found, a discarded tire iron, and attempted to wield it defensively. The man merely grinned, his mouth full of horrifyingly sharp teeth. He raised the chain high above his head, ready to strike. I swung the tire iron directly at him with all the strength I could muster. To my surprise and relief, it struck his arm with a sickening crunch of bone meeting metal. The man howled in agony, dropping the chain as he stumbled backward. Seizing this opportunity, I hurried over to Morris and tried to drag him away from the gruesome scene as quickly as possible. I wasn't strong enough to carry him, so instead we stumbled awkwardly on our slow retreat toward my truck. Through labored breaths, Morris pleaded with me. "Please, you've got to call for help." I tried, I gasped. "My phone isn't working. We just need to get out of here." As we continued our slow escape, we noticed that our sinister pursuer was recovering remarkably fast from his injury and stood up once again. Blood dripped from his wounded arm, but he seemed unfazed and started heading toward us with an expression that suggested diabolical retribution. While struggling on our way back to the truck stop apron, we came across another driver who had finally emerged from behind his parked rig. Desperate for any assistance against this relentless stalker, I called out for help. "Please," I begged the stranger, "we need your help." This guy attacked us. The driver hesitated before tentatively moving towards us. He stared at our aggressive assailant, then back at us. As he came closer, the seriousness of our plight seemed to register with him. Who is that guy? What's going on?" he stuttered. "I don't know," I panted as my exhaustion began to crest, "but he won't stop. We need to call the cops." The stranger pulled out his phone and dialed 911 successfully. With law enforcement alerted, we continued our retreat until we reached a reasonably safe distance from the lurking menace. Hours later, when Morris, the stranger, and I were sitting in a warm, well-lit diner just off the highway while waiting for police officers to arrive, we exchanged stories about the unnerving events that had transpired. We learned that our attacker was a man known as Leonard Harris, who was sadistic and notorious for leaving trails of victims in his wake across the country. As I left the truck stop and headed back on the road after giving my statement to the police, I reflected on my brief yet harrowing interaction with Leonard Harris. Many questions still lingered in my mind. Why didn't he finish us off after my desperate tire iron blow? What did he want from us? While en route to my next delivery destination, I noticed something scribbled in bold letters on one of my truck mirrors. It read, "I'll see you down the line." I shivered at the thought of crossing paths with Leonard Harris again. The haunting encounter would never leave me. It gnawed at me with each smile, covered an eerie and gruesome reminder that some threats lie in wait for their next opportunity. The air was cool and crisp as I hauled the load across the United States, driving my 18-wheeler to its final destination. My name is Jarvis Gilman, and being a truck driver has always suited me well. The solitude was my sanctuary, but at this particular moment, I might have appreciated some company. I had stopped at a little-known diner off the main highway. It struck me as an ideal place for some local fare and small talk with the good folks of Montpelier, Idaho. As I dug into my sandwich, an older gentleman sitting nearby let out a hearty chuckle and looked at me with wise and mirthful eyes. "So, young fella," he began, "did you know that this area was once terrorized by an infamous, unidentified serial killer? Locals called him the Beast, though nobody ever managed to get a good look at him. They say he just slipped away into the shadows like fog escaping through your fingers." Of course, I chuckled in response to his tale. After all, who wouldn't love a good story about a legendary threat? "Well then," I grinned, "hopefully he's reformed his ways by now." With that, we exchanged pleasantries before parting ways, with me getting back on the road and him going to parts unknown. A few hours later, I found myself parked near an industrial complex not too far from Montpelier. It was getting late, and I needed an extra boost of coffee to keep me alert for the remaining stretch of my journey. Tired legs carrying me toward my cab sleep compartment, I suddenly realized that I had left my thermos back at the diner. Resigned to its loss, I was ready to get back on track when all of a sudden, there it was. My thermos sat atop a small heap of garbage bags not far from my truck in what looked like an abandoned parking lot. How on earth? As I stepped closer, I noticed a man shrouded in darkness with barely discernible features. My gut twisted in unease, but determined to retrieve my lost treasure, I stepped forward and blurted out a feigned friendliness. "Hey there, thanks for finding my thermos." The strange figure said nothing, his movement still as the grave. In that moment, curiosity morphed into concern. My breath caught in my throat as fear urged me to flee, my instincts alerting me to an impending threat. But escape would be deceptively elusive. The shadowed figure lunged at me with a sudden force that knocked me off balance and pinned me down against the ground, one hand gripping my throat with a vice like strength. My vision blurred as the menacing silhouette hovered over me. This was the beast, and I knew it without question. Fight or flight instincts kicked in gear, each desperate breath fueling the terrors of helplessness. A sharp stab of pain pierced my leg as a serrated knife carved deep into flesh and muscle. Blood oozed from the fresh wound as I struggled against an overpowering foe. Despite the sensation of searing hot iron flooding through my veins, I managed to grasp blindly at the assailant's arm, frantically ripping and clawing for freedom. In a sudden burst of strength, I managed to pry the attacker's hand from my throat and push him off me. I scrambled to my feet, my vision hazy, and glanced around for a way to escape. The parking lot was deserted, not a single nearby car or person. I couldn't call for help because there was no one to hear me. The beast rose back to his feet, his heavily scarred face and menacing grin now clearly visible under the faint glow of a nearby lamppost. His bloody knife gleamed dangerously in the dim light, as did the murderous intent in his cold eyes. Acting out of pure survival instinct, I grabbed an abandoned metal pipe from nearby debris, readying myself for a life or death battle. Facing each other across the darkened lot, we circled warily like two predators, sizing each other up before the kill. The air grew thick with tension as we moved closer together. My heart pounded wildly with each step, trying to focus solely on anticipating his next brutal move. A sudden distant echoing noise served as the signal for him to strike. Lightning fast like a pit viper, he lunged forward, aiming for my chest. Reflexes sharpened by years of experience dodging hazards behind the wheel. I parried his attack with a swing of my improvised weapon and countered with a solid blow across his face. The beast staggered backward momentarily, but seemed unperturbed. Any well-developed sense of pain had long ago been lost in what must have been a twisted maze of scars etching his skin. He grinned with excitement as if this cat and mouse chase had only just begun. With no end in sight, we continued our violent dance, jabbing and dodging, swinging recklessly yet defending fiercely. It wasn't until seconds turned to minutes that I noticed another figure on the periphery of my vision. Someone observing our struggle with keen but terrified eyes. The observer seemed familiar, and in the heat of the moment, I briefly recognized him as the old man from the diner. My heart swelled with a small shred of hope, but his hands remained clasped before him in mute terror instead of reaching for help. Locking eyes with the old man for just an instant, I saw his lips form a name, Thomas Grimm. The beast paused as if noticing his unwanted witness. He turned his ice-cold glare towards the old man, and in that momentary diversion, I slammed into him with my entire weight. Grimm tumbled to the ground with a gasp, his knife clattering away across the pavement on impact. Seizing an opportunity to escape, I limped as fast as my injured leg would allow towards my truck. As quick as possible, I flung open the door and climbed into the cab. All thoughts of continuing my original route gone. Adrenaline carried me onwards until distance swallowed up any chance of what had become my worst nightmare making good on his silent promise to return. Weeks later, After recuperating at home from my gruesome encounter, I discovered that Thomas Grimm was once a local figure of infamy before disappearing several years prior. His cruel methods and uncanny skill at evading capture had earned him legendary status. Whispers that circulated amongst those who dared remember the beast of Montpelier, Idaho. Maybe living to tell his twisted tale would set others on guard. Perhaps uncovering Grimm's identity instead aligned crosshairs onto my back. Or possibly some secrets are simply better left buried under darkness. But one truth remained. Sometimes monsters hide among us in plain sight. It was bizarre as I filled up my truck and began my daily job as a truck driver in the small town of Acme, Pennsylvania. I spotted something strange on the windshield of my trusty semi-truck. There was a peculiarly shaped red splatter. It vaguely resembled a sinister face with a twisted grin, which gave me goosebumps. I shrugged it off and hit the road. You never know what kind of weird stuff you'll find in this line of work. As I steered my way through the snaking roads and fog-covered hills of Pennsylvania, I noticed something even stranger. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with missed calls from an unknown number. Finally, annoyed to no end by this persistent caller, I pulled over to the side of the road to answer it. "Hello," I barked into the phone. "Who's driving alongside you?" whispered a hoarse voice filled with panic. "What are you talking about?" "Nobody's." My voice trailed off as I glanced in the side mirror. Behind me was another truck that wasn't there just minutes before. "Ignore him," the ominous voice hissed over the call. But how could I ignore them? They were glued to my tailgate at an uncomfortably close distance. Feeling cornered and confused by this nightmare on wheels, I decided to try and lose him by speeding up, only to find that the menacing truck matched my pace perfectly. Well, thought Phil more gentle, father of 3 kids, and an aspiring comedian who was slowly losing his mind under the pressure of this ordeal. At least he likes to go fast. And at that moment, my unnamed tormentor floored it as their truck started to veer aggressively toward mine, and initiated a deadly game of chicken between our rigs. That sinister red grin streaked across their windshield, seemingly mocking me in the moonlight. In response, I steered closer to the edge of the cliff, my truck screeching as I went. For a split second, I contemplated whether ditching the chase would be futile, but with sheer grit and determination, I pressed the pedal harder. And moments later, I found my antagonizer falling behind. Sweating profusely, I pulled over at the next rest stop to catch my breath. As I paced outside by the vending machines, recounting all that had just transpired, an elderly man approached me. "Are you all right there, son?" His furrowed brow showed concern that someone else had noticed me. I responded with a quivering voice, telling him about my recent brush with death. A glimmer of horror flashed across his eyes as he muttered, "That truck, I've heard of it. A lunatic drives it, takes pleasure in tormenting drivers like you and me." When I asked whether anyone knew who this driver was, or why they do what they do, the old man only shook his head and walked away. His silence did little to abate my apprehension. Despite feeling uneasy, I couldn't rest any longer on another human's word. So I hopped back into my rig with one goal in mind: to get home safely to see my family. It wasn't much longer before that dreaded truck reappeared behind me again, like a chilling specter in my rearview mirror. The splattered crimson smile seemed alive and taunted me to react. "Not this time. I mumbled under my breath as the terrifying game of cat and mouse resumed. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the situation. I couldn't bring myself to call for help, fearing that any sudden movements might provoke my relentless pursuer. Instead, I decided to outrun him and expose his identity. I continued my drive, trying to find the nearest police station, while also keeping an eye on the wicked grin that haunted me at every turn or intersection. The truck remained glued to mine as if our fates were intertwined. I couldn't fathom the sick pleasure this person derived from terrorizing an innocent truck driver. Moreover, what could they possibly want from me? My salvation came in the form of a woman standing by the side of the road with a broken-down car. She flagged me down, and I pulled over, glad for any excuse to distance myself from the menacing truck behind me, even if only for a brief moment. As I stepped out of my truck and approached her, I noticed that she was holding something behind her back. My instincts warned me of imminent danger, but it was too late. The woman swung around and revealed a large knife, slashing at me in wild arcs. Reflexively, I stumbled back just in time to dodge her ruthless attack. The next moments unfolded like an unhinged circus act. She lunged at me repeatedly with the knife while screaming obscenities. Somehow, I managed to extract myself from this peril and return to my truck, all while the malevolent truck driver watched silently from a distance within eerie stillness. As fate would have it, there was an oncoming police patrol responding to an unrelated matter that happened during our altercation, and intervened before it escalated further. With guns drawn and focused on the vicious woman, they demanded that she drop her weapon. Shockingly, she obliged and was apprehended without further incident. I took advantage of the confusion and slipped away in my truck before the sinister driver managed to resume their chase. Several days later, while recuperating at home, I received a call from an investigator updating me on the situation. The woman, it turned out, was part of a larger network of people who engaged in terrorizing innocent drivers on the road. "What about the truck driver?" I asked tensely. The investigator responded wearily, "We can't locate him or his truck. It's like he vanished into thin air." We did, however, manage to identify him due to the unique paint pattern on his windshield. His name is Marvin Wraith. My hands trembled as I absorbed this revelation. It now made sense why he was so elusive and sadistic in his approach. His entire existence revolved around inflicting suffering upon others without reason. Knowing that he was still out in the world, facing no consequences for his actions, made me uneasy. I was still in danger. The weight of it all manifested itself as an unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach, which refused to abate. Months went by, and although I never encountered Marvin Wraith again, I remained vigilant for myself, my family, and other unsuspecting drivers who might fall prey to his sinister designs. But until then, if there would be a then, the only thing left for me to cling to was hope. I hoped that Marvin Wraith would be caught and brought to justice, that my life would return to normalcy, and that I wouldn't spend my days always looking over my shoulder in fear. That eerie crimson grin continued to haunt me, but my resolve never wavered. Still, the question remained: when would this unparalleled game of cat and mouse come to an end? Or worse, would it ever end at all? My name is Colin Jonathan, and I am a truck driver. You know, I've always admired those comedians who can turn mundane experiences into something hilarious. Just the other day, a bird pooped on my windshield, and I was like, why do they always aim for the driver's side? I wish birds just had better manners. It was one of those uneventful days when I pulled into a rest area somewhere in Iowa for a much-needed break. The rest area seemed to be just what you'd expect. People coming and going with their families, truckers stopping for a quick meal and a nap, nothing out of the ordinary. As I made my way to the restroom, I noticed an older gentleman sitting on a bench, looking incredibly pale. He appeared disoriented, almost as if he'd been through something strenuous or frightening. Had it been any other day or place, I might have stopped to check on him, had that not been against my very nature. Nonetheless, the image of the man's haggard state stayed with me as I tried to push it out of my mind and continue with my business. After washing up and grabbing a hot cup of coffee from the vending machine, I made my way back to my truck, where I knew Troy, a fellow trucker, would meet up with me soon. As we settled down and began to catch up on our recent exploits, we heard several loud bangs in quick succession. A split second later, shouts followed by utter silence filled the air. Sitting across from us at another table was a person who sent shivers down our spines. Someone we had never seen before, adorned in tattered clothes that hung off their ill-proportioned frame like rags. Their sunken eyes peered menacingly from beneath matted hair. Feeling vulnerable and no longer having any sense of security at what should have been a peaceful rest stop, we hopped back in our trucks without a word. There was something innately unsettling about that person, and we didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. We were driving along the highway when we saw flashing lights from an ambulance up ahead. As we got closer, I could see more clearly the gruesome scene that it was responding to. The older man from the rest stop was lying on the ground next to several people, some of whom had terrible injuries. It was clear that something monstrous had happened. I couldn't help but think back to that unkempt stranger who had stared us down with unnerving intensity. With all that had transpired between then and now, their presence during our brief encounter seemed even more sinister. Finding ourselves at another rest area much later on, Troy and I recounted the harrowing events of the day. We couldn't shake the feeling that an unseen force was somehow watching us from afar. That feeling only intensified when we noticed that several other individuals who shared our pastime were seemingly going through similar experiences. Perhaps it was naive or seasoned trepidation that kept me from calling for help. Whatever it may be, my instincts told me that it wasn't the work of some random assailant, but rather an individual with a rare capacity for violence. As eerie as everything sounded, there was no way to prove any of our suspicions without coming off as overactive or paranoid truck drivers, spinning yarns over cups of coffee late at night. Stories not meant for daylight conversations. We both decided to carry on and simply be more vigilant, making sure we never spent too long lingering at any stops along our routes. A week later, I had all but forgotten about those strange occurrences when I found myself passing through Iowa once again, by no volition of my own, but rather by assignment from up high. Out of sheer interest, or perhaps morbid curiosity, I detoured to the original rest stop. As I pulled into the parking lot, it was a scene eerily reminiscent of that fateful day. As I stepped out of my truck, I heard Troy's voice, my ever-present beacon of support. and turned to see him pulling right beside me. Our eyes met with an unspoken understanding as we faced whatever awaited us with unmatched courage, shared from one trembling hand to another. As Troy and I stepped into the rest area, an overwhelming sense of dread enveloped us. We saw smeared blood stains on the floor and walls, hinting at the terrible acts that must have taken place since our last visit. Though we knew that calling for help would be the sensible thing to do, there was an inexplicable urge to face this menace ourselves, a compulsion to see who or what had caused this horrifying scene. We wearily made our way through the desolate building, meticulously examining each room for signs of danger. In one corner, we discovered a woman brutally attacked and struggling to remain conscious. Her terrified eyes implored us to save her. Moving with unyielding determination, Troy and I worked together to help her while keeping an eye out for the mysterious figure we'd encountered earlier. We quickly patched her up in a makeshift manner, urging her to seek proper medical attention as soon as possible. The woman nodded weakly and whispered her gratitude before managing to reveal some crucial information about the attacker. Glancing over our shoulders, she described the man as tall, extremely thin, and possessing an unnatural strength. Furthermore, she added that his name was Raylan Burke, a name that evoked no prior recognition amongst either of us. As we continued through the blood-soaked hallways of the rest area, we encountered several more similarly ghastly scenes. In each case, it seemed as though Raylan had attacked without pity or remorse, mere inches from where people were innocently going about their day-to-day lives. Despite his chilling actions, we found ourselves compelled to discover more about this man. His motivations, his origins, anything that could help us understand why he had embarked upon this frenzied path of destruction. Tracking down a local truck stop frequented by truckers in the region, we befriended an old-timer named Hank, who told us wild tales of an unemployed factory worker named Raylan Burke. Desperate and in debt, he turned to robbery to support his family, but eventually found himself irreparably changed after years of living on the edge. It appeared as though his desperation had transformed him into a ruthless and merciless killer. His motivation seemed to be rooted in a deep hatred for authority and those who choose to act as enforcers of the law. And truck drivers, in his twisted perspective, were no different. As we learned more about Raylan and his motivations, Troy and I became even more determined to put an end to his reign of terror. Despite the danger, we knew better than to attack him head-on, given his particular set of skills and deranged predisposition. Instead, we decided to continue tracking him down until we could make a coordinated strike alongside local law enforcement, ideally catching him off guard before he had a chance to react. In the meantime, we resolved to warn our fellow truckers about the danger they faced on the open road. During one dark night, after reporting another gruesome incident at a truck stop, the police arrived at the scene. We maintained our distance while observing their investigation from afar. As the anticipation grew unbearably tense, we felt compelled to warn them about Raylan's heightened senses and proclivity for violence. However, just as we were about to make contact with the officers, Raylan himself emerged from behind a nearby building, eerily calm and unfazed by our presence. With blood-curdling screams echoing through our ears, along with images of carnage freshly burned into our minds, we could do nothing but watch in horror as he vanished into the abyss of the night. The experience left us pondering whether or not to continue pursuing this monstrous killer, or if any effort would inevitably lead only to further death and destruction at Raylan Burke's hands. The question remained unanswered as terror hung in the air, leaving us to wonder if it was only a matter of time before we met our own gruesome fate in the ever-darkening path ahead. Right after I dropped out of college, my life was in shambles, and to support myself, I had to take this temporary job working overnight security for a mid-range business hotel. It was maybe only 6 weeks of work before the regular guy returned from medical leave or something, but it kept me financially stable while my parents were pressuring me to pay them rent. Harsh but fair, I suppose. Working there was mostly uneventful, especially during the later hours. But after a while, the lack of sunlight really started affecting my mental health. I'd start at 11 p.m., do a few patrol walks around the property, help the bartender close down the lounge when it shut at midnight. Then I was generally free to watch late-night television and raid the kitchen for leftover pastries. Then I'd watch the sunrise from the rooftop before clocking out around 6:30 in the morning. The 6 weeks went by relatively smoothly, and it was literally my final shift before starting a new job when I went through one of the most heart-pounding incidents of my young adult life. Everything was proceeding normally until just after 6 a.m., when the front desk called me on my radio and reported a noise complaint from one of the occupied rooms. Apparently, a guest's alarm clock had been going off for almost 25 minutes straight, and it was irritating numerous neighboring rooms to the point where they were calling the front desk to complain. To make matters worse, the front desk informed me that the room had requested a wake-up call 45 minutes earlier and hadn't answered multiple attempts to call them. I told them I'd investigate. Then I started heading up to the room with Marcus, the maintenance guy, joining me just in case we encountered any problems. We got to the door, and sure enough, the alarm clock was blaring at full volume. One of those really obnoxious old-style digital ones. I could hear the room's phone ringing as well. The big, heavy, older model phone with an actual bell mechanism. So I could totally understand why people were upset about all the racket. I knocked on the door and shouted over the noise. No answer. I pounded on the door harder. No answer. I used my key card and started to open the door, and that's when I realized the security chain was still connected. I immediately froze. I guess I had unconsciously assumed the room was empty given the volume of noise coming from inside. But the security chain can only be fastened by someone inside the room. My mind started racing. I used my card to slip the security chain, then opened the door, and lying face down on the bed, half covered by a comforter, was a middle-aged man. And it absolutely did not look like he was breathing. I glanced at the maintenance guy, who gave me a look that said, "What do you want me to do?" I entered the room and called out, "Excuse me, sir," in the loudest voice I could manage, loud enough to be heard over the alarm and the telephone, just praying for him to wake up and for everything to be okay. But I got nothing. No response whatsoever. It sounds ridiculous, but even though I was pretty sure he was dead, I gave it one more attempt out of pure wishful thinking. I got right next to the bed, and much louder this time, I shouted, "Excuse me, sir," while reaching out to grab the man's shoulder and shake it, yelling, "Excuse me, sir," as loud as I possibly could. Suddenly, the guy lifted his head up, looked at me with complete confusion, and when we explained that we thought he was deceased, it turned out he was just extremely intoxicated and hadn't heard any of his alarms. He asked us, in slurred speech, if we could turn off the alarm for him. We obliged, walked out of the room, and breathed a massive sigh of relief. Thinking that guy was dead, and then thinking that I, a 20-year-old, was somehow responsible for him. It was the most terrifying feeling of my life up to that point. I'd never performed CPR, barely paid attention during the first aid classes we'd gotten in high school. And for a moment, I genuinely thought it was going to be entirely up to me to save that man's life. Thankfully, that wasn't the case, but feeling so unprepared bothered me so much that I think that incident became the catalyst for me actually growing up and not acting like a kid anymore. Nothing like a brush with mortality to make you realize we've only got so much time in this world, and you'd better not waste it. I used to work security for a downtown high-rise apartment building, and without a doubt, the worst thing about the job were the jumpers. The number of people who took their own lives while I was working there was absolutely haunting. There were roughly 5 per year during the 9 years that I worked there. The worst one for me was this elderly woman in her 70s. She went to the top floor and jumped, fell through a large oak tree, and hit the concrete sidewalk below. She left a body-shaped impression in the tree canopy. The fire department came to clean the sidewalk. Little did they know, a significant piece of her remains was underneath a parked car she'd landed next to. It wasn't discovered until the next morning when that person left for work, and there it was, just sitting there on the asphalt. Her adult children had to fly in from different states to handle her estate. On the kitchen table in her apartment was a handwritten note. She explained that because they weren't planning to visit her for the holidays that year, she didn't see any reason to continue existing. Both of them completely broke down sobbing when they read that letter. We almost had to call for medical assistance to check on them. Over the next 4 weeks, they would come into our security office and demand to see the surveillance footage that showed their mother entering the elevator, going up to the roof access, and throwing herself off the building, then hitting the ground. Our building manager and legal counsel both refused to release this footage to her children. That whole situation still haunts me to this day. Those loud, deep sobs of pure anguish that those grown adults let out will forever be burned into my memory. I was a security guard at a homeless shelter here in the city. We had a regular who would hang around our property named Frank. He would, for the most part, be cooperative and move along when asked. One evening, I found him slouched over against our building's side wall, not looking great at all, so I asked him if he was doing all right. He said yes, but didn't respond in a very convincing way, so I asked if he needed medical help or if he'd been using drugs or alcohol that day. He said just drinking like usual, and as I got closer, I noticed what appeared to be dried blood on his winter cap. I put on some disposable gloves and moved in closer, pulling his hat off to discover that Frank had a massive wound on his scalp, roughly 10 inches long and completely infested with maggots. This man had approximately 30 to 40 maggots covering his head injury, just feeding naturally. I immediately called 911 and requested medical assistance, making sure to warn the paramedics beforehand about what they were going to encounter. Both of the EMTs were absolutely horrified when we brought them to him, but they still took him away to get proper medical treatment. I haven't seen Frank since that day, and I just hope he's doing better now. Working security can really bring some deeply disturbing moments into your life. I used to work security at a strip mall here in Arizona. The mall was owned by some property management company who rented the units to various businesses, but hired us as security for the entire complex. This meant we were responsible for all the security cameras as well as the footage storage. And it was through this system that I helped a business owner recover video evidence from our digital recording system. Long story short, it showed him defending his store by shooting 4 men who attempted to rob his establishment. And it went something like this. The store owner is behind the counter, just conducting normal business, when 4 robbers burst into his store. 3 of the men immediately run toward the beverage coolers, while the 4th points a handgun at the owner. Then, as soon as the 3 guys grabbed cases of beer and started running toward the exit, the 4th robber drops his weapon. Yeah, Butterfingers just drops his pistol, and there's this perfect, "oh crap" expression on his face. In that instant, the store owner pulls out a shotgun from behind the counter and just starts firing. You can see the first robber go down right outside the doorway on both camera angles. We had cameras pointed at the interior of the entrance and others covering the exterior. The 4th robber begins shooting wildly in the general direction of the store owner after picking his gun back up. But he doesn't hit anything except merchandise displays and shelving units. The store owner hits the floor, then comes back up with his shotgun and opens fire on the shooter, who goes down halfway through the doorway, basically blocking the exit. The last robber is trying to make his escape through the door, but his partner's body is slowing him down, and the store owner pursues him, shooting him down in the parking lot. The robber with the gun died at the scene, while the first guy who got shot survived his injuries. I don't remember exactly what happened to the one who took the shotgun blast in the parking lot, but I don't think he died either. Incredible to think about, but I guess that's reality. The whole incident happened so fast, it's all over in just a few seconds when you watch the video footage. But the thing that really disturbed me was the way the store owner acted while reviewing the whole thing afterward. I know he was entitled to defend himself, and no one should have to apologize for protecting their property and their life. But I don't know. If that was me, I wouldn't be so celebratory about it. It seemed like he took genuine pleasure in knowing that he'd killed one of the robbers. It didn't seem to affect him at all emotionally. I guess there are some people out there who are better suited for taking a life than others. I don't care what anyone says. That's just genuinely unsettling to me. I work security at a nuclear power facility, which means we're positioned very close to a massive river that feeds our cooling systems. Our surveillance cameras have some seriously impressive zoom capabilities, and over the years, we've observed quite a few interesting things happening on the shoreline on the opposite side of the river. The facility sits right on this wide section of river that's maybe half a mile across at its widest point. During the winter months, the whole thing freezes over solid, thick enough that you could probably drive a truck across it. though obviously nobody's allowed to do that given our security protocols. The ice usually starts forming in late December and doesn't fully break up until sometime in March. We've got multiple camera stations positioned around the perimeter, and part of our regular duties involves scanning the area for any unusual activity. Most of the time, it's pretty routine. Maybe some ice fishermen way downstream, or the occasional snowmobile tracks, but nothing that poses any kind of security concern. The most interesting incident I can think of happened during my third winter working at the plant. We'd been having an unusually harsh cold snap, with temperatures staying below zero for almost 2 weeks straight. The river had frozen over completely, creating this vast white expanse that stretched as far as you could see in either direction. It started with the elk. We'd noticed a small herd of them, maybe 6 or 7 animals, that had been coming down to the river's edge for the past few days. They seemed to be struggling to find food sources with all the deep snow we'd been getting, and they kept venturing further and further out onto the ice, probably looking for vegetation underneath. Then came the wolves. We'd spotted wolf tracks in the area before, but this was the first time we'd actually seen the pack in action. There were 4 of them, and they seemed to have been tracking this particular herd for quite some time. You could tell they were experienced hunters. They knew exactly how to use the frozen river to their advantage. The chase itself was absolutely incredible to watch, even from our distance. These wolves had clearly done this before. They worked together to separate one of the elk from the main herd, then systematically drove it further and further out onto the ice, away from any escape routes back to the wooded shoreline. The elk they targeted was a younger male, probably not as experienced with winter survival as the older members of the herd. You could see it was already exhausted from fighting through the deep snow, and once the wolves got it isolated on the open ice, it didn't really stand much of a chance. The whole pursuit lasted maybe 20 or 30 minutes, with the wolves taking turns harassing the elk, wearing it down bit by bit. They'd dart in, snap at its legs or flanks, then back off before it could retaliate. Classic pack hunting behavior. The end came when the elk, in its desperation to escape, crashed through a section of thinner ice right next to our water intake facility. The sound echoed across the frozen river. This tremendous crack, followed by a splash that you could hear even from inside our security building. The poor animal went straight down into the frigid water, and with the temperature being what it was, hypothermia set in almost immediately. It managed to get its head and neck above the surface, probably trying to pull itself back up onto the ice. But the shock of the cold water had already done its damage. Within minutes, it had frozen to death with just its neck and head sticking above the ice surface. The wolves seemed to understand immediately that their prey was finished, because they just sat there on the solid ice nearby, waiting. But here's where it gets interesting. The wolves eventually lost interest and moved on, probably figuring the carcass was too difficult to access with all that ice around it. But a pair of mountain lions, an adult female and what looked like a juvenile, discovered it a few days later. These cats would show up every few nights, and somehow they'd figured out how to get down to the elk without falling through the ice themselves. They'd spend hours just methodically feeding on whatever parts of the carcass they could reach from above the waterline. Every time I would zoom in on the scene during my regular security sweeps, just to see how the situation was developing, it would give me the absolute creeps. Just this frozen elk head staring back at you from across the water, with these mountain lions circling around it like some kind of macabre feast. It sounds completely ridiculous, but even from that considerable distance away, we're talking at least 400 yards, it felt like that dead elk was looking directly at you. That was just how powerful the magnification on our camera system was. You could see individual whiskers on those mountain lions, and every detail of that elk's frozen face. The whole scene continued for weeks. The cats would disappear for a few days, then come back and continue their feeding. Meanwhile, that elk head just remained there, perfectly preserved by the cold, staring out across the frozen river with those glassy, dead eyes. It wasn't until the spring thaw finally came in late March that the whole carcass finally broke free and got swept downstream. But even now, years later, whenever I'm doing my security rounds and I zoom in on that particular section of the river, I still think about that frozen elk head and how it seemed to be watching us. Still, that little incident definitely stayed with me throughout all these years of working at the plant. There's something about witnessing nature's brutality up close like that, even from a distance, that really sticks with you. And the way our high-tech surveillance equipment could capture every detail of it made it feel almost too real, too immediate. Working security at a nuclear facility, you expect to deal with potential human threats, security protocols, radiation safety, all that technical stuff. You don't really expect to become a witness to the kind of primal life and death drama that's been playing out in the wilderness for thousands of years. But I guess that's just part of the job when you're stationed in a remote location like this, right at the intersection of advanced technology and the natural world. This was almost 12 years ago now, and I have since left the security industry entirely. But I'm not naming any specific names or locations in order to protect the people involved. This happened on the very night of my very first assignment. I had to do what we called displacement watch, which is basically what they call the night shift when you're helping to evacuate a condemned building. I was working at this absolutely horrific 2-story motel that had about 50 rooms total. The entire building had been condemned by the city because the back stairwell that connected the 2 floors was structurally unsound and about to collapse completely. Code enforcement and the fire department had red-tagged the whole place anyway. My job was to assist in getting every single person out of the motel so they could relocate to alternative housing that the owner was supposedly arranging. The entire place was filled with people who were living week to week, mostly drug addicts, people struggling with mental illness, and folks who were just barely avoiding homelessness by scraping together enough money for weekly room rentals. The parking lot was packed with beaten-up cars that looked like they hadn't run in months, maybe years. It was a completely run-down and deteriorating place, like something you'd see in a post-apocalyptic movie. This was in the worst part of Sacramento, California, right in the middle of summer, and the whole property was littered with used needles and drug paraphernalia. And oh my God, the cockroaches. The cockroach infestation in these rooms was something I'd never seen before and hope to never see again. I had to go door to door with a code enforcement officer who was wearing a body camera for documentation purposes, as well as a fire department inspector. Everyone who answered their door was clearly struggling with substance abuse and appeared to be completely disconnected from reality. I remember knocking on the door of one woman's room. She had 6 kids living in there with her, a single mother trying to keep her family together, with garbage bags piled up to the ceiling inside the room and cockroaches crawling over absolutely everything. It was one of the most heartbreaking sights I've ever witnessed in my life. Every single occupant was given 6 hours to pack up whatever they could physically carry and vacate the premises. Most of them tried desperately to gather up their entire lives, but they simply couldn't manage it. So much personal property was left behind in those rooms. So many people approached me asking for help or wanting to know what they were supposed to do next, and I didn't have any answers for them. I was just the security guy whose job was to make sure everyone got out safely. I couldn't provide them with resources or solutions to their problems. I couldn't believe the living conditions these people were enduring just to avoid sleeping on the streets. It really opened my eyes to what I had in my own life: a decent home, stable employment, family support. These folks were living in absolute squalor, sharing their beds with millions of insects, just to have a roof over their heads. The smell inside each room was indescribable. It was this combination of mold, human waste, rotting food, and something else I couldn't quite identify, but that made my stomach turn. You could smell the building from the parking lot, even with all the doors and windows closed. And we started going through the rooms systematically, starting with the ground floor. I realized just how extensive the cockroach problem really was. We're not talking about seeing a few bugs here and there. We're talking about walls that were literally moving because they were covered in so many cockroaches. Thousands upon thousands of them in every single room. The bathroom situations were particularly horrific. Most of the plumbing hadn't worked properly in months, so people were dealing with overflowing toilets and sinks that wouldn't drain. Some rooms had makeshift solutions, where residents had been collecting waste in containers, because the actual facilities were completely unusable. One elderly man, probably in his 70s, answered his door wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His room was filled with what appeared to be everything he owned in the world: old newspapers, broken electronics, clothes that were more holes than fabric. He kept asking me if there was somewhere he could go, if anyone was going to help him find a new place to live. The truth was, I had no idea. The motel owner had supposedly arranged alternative housing, but nobody seemed to know any specifics about where that was or how people were supposed to access it. It felt like these vulnerable people were just being pushed out into the street with nowhere to go. There was a middle-aged woman with what appeared to be severe mental illness who kept insisting that her room was clean and safe, even though it was obviously in the same terrible condition as all the others. She couldn't understand why she was being forced to leave, and she kept asking if she could just clean up her room and stay. It was clear that this motel room, horrible as it was, represented the only stability she had in her life. The code enforcement officer kept documenting everything with his camera, taking videos of the living conditions, the structural damage, the health hazards. He'd been doing this kind of work for years, but even he seemed shocked by what we were finding. He told me later that this was one of the worst situations he'd encountered in his career. As we moved through the building, I started to notice other problems beyond just the cockroaches and general decay. There were holes in the walls where people had punched through the drywall, either in frustration or during drug-fueled episodes. Electrical outlets were sparking and clearly dangerous. Windows were broken and had been covered with cardboard or plastic sheeting. The fire department inspector was documenting safety violations left and right. The emergency exits were blocked, the smoke detectors had been removed or destroyed, and the electrical system was a disaster waiting to happen. He said it was a miracle the place hadn't burned down already. Some rooms appeared to have been abandoned recently, with personal belongings still scattered around, but no sign of the occupants. These were somehow even more depressing than the occupied rooms, because you could see the evidence of people's lives, family photographs, children's toys, medications, just left behind when they couldn't keep up with the weekly rent. One room that particularly stuck with me belonged to what must have been a young mother. There were baby clothes and diapers, a crib that had been assembled in the corner, and children's books scattered on the floor among all the cockroaches. I couldn't help but think about what it must have been like trying to raise a child in those conditions. The fire department inspector explained to me that the building's main structural problem was that the back stairwell had been damaged in some kind of accident months earlier, and instead of properly repairing it, the owner had just tried to patch it up with inadequate materials. The whole thing was now on the verge of complete collapse, which would have trapped anyone on the second floor. As the evening progressed, and we worked our way through more and more rooms, I started to feel physically sick from the combination of the smell, the heat, and the emotional weight of what I was witnessing. The cockroaches were so numerous that they were getting on my clothes, in my hair, crawling up my legs. I kept having to step outside just to breathe fresh air and shake them off. The code enforcement officer had brought some spare protective gear, so I ended up wearing disposable coveralls, gloves, and a face mask for the remainder of the shift. Even with all that protection, I was still constantly worried about bringing cockroaches home to my own apartment. Some of the residents became angry and confrontational as the night went on. They'd been given this 6-hour deadline, but many of them didn't have transportation, didn't have money for a taxi or bus, and didn't have friends or family who could help them move their belongings. They were basically being told to abandon most of their possessions and figure out alternative housing on their own. One man, probably in his 40s, became particularly upset when he realized he was going to have to leave behind a collection of books that clearly meant a lot to him. He'd managed to pack clothes and basic necessities, but there was no way he could carry dozens of books along with everything else. He kept asking if he could come back for them later, and we had to explain that the building was being permanently closed and secured. There were also several people who appeared to be dealing with serious medical conditions, but didn't have access to proper health care. One woman was clearly struggling with some kind of respiratory problem, probably made worse by living in a mold-infested environment. She was coughing constantly and seemed to have trouble breathing, but she didn't have transportation to get to a hospital or the money to pay for treatment. The whole situation really drove home how many people are just barely hanging on financially. These weren't necessarily people who had made terrible life choices. Some of them were clearly dealing with mental illness. Others had lost jobs due to the economic downturn. And some were elderly people on fixed incomes who simply couldn't afford anything better. By around 3 in the morning, we'd made it through about 3/4 of the occupied rooms. The pattern was pretty much the same in every single one: deplorable living conditions, overwhelming cockroach infestations, and residents who were struggling with various combinations of poverty, addiction, mental illness, and medical problems. The fire department inspector had to call in additional personnel because the list of safety violations was so extensive. They needed to document everything properly before the building could be officially condemned and secured. He said the electrical system alone posed an immediate fire hazard that could have killed everyone in the building. Some of the residents had already left by that point, loading whatever possessions they could into shopping carts or garbage bags and disappearing into the night. Others were still trying desperately to figure out what to do, making phone calls to friends or family members who might be able to help them. As we approached the final few rooms, I was starting to feel emotionally overwhelmed by the whole experience. Seeing that level of human suffering and desperation, especially knowing that many of these people were probably going to end up sleeping on the streets, was really getting to me. The last room we checked belonged to an elderly woman who appeared to be in the early stages of dementia. She couldn't really understand what was happening or why she needed to leave. She kept asking for her daughter, who apparently hadn't been in contact with her for months. The code enforcement officer ended up calling Adult Protective Services to make sure she wouldn't just be abandoned on the street. When we finally finished the evacuation process around dawn, I felt like I needed to throw away everything I was wearing and take about 6 showers. I was so paranoid about bringing cockroaches home to my own place. I ended up burning my work pants and boots when I got home. I washed my uniform shirt probably 8 times and threw away all my protective gear. I was genuinely terrified of infesting my own apartment with cockroaches. Millions upon millions of them had been living in that motel, and they were all going to scatter when the building was finally demolished. I kept imagining them crawling on me, getting into my car, following me home. The whole experience completely changed my perspective on homelessness and poverty. Before that night, I think I had this naive assumption that most people experiencing homelessness had somehow brought it on themselves through poor decisions or lack of effort. But seeing families with children living in those conditions, seeing elderly people and disabled individuals who clearly couldn't take care of themselves properly, really opened my eyes to how quickly anyone's life can fall apart. The motel was demolished about 2 weeks later. I heard through the grapevine that most of the residents ended up scattered to other similar establishments or sleeping rough. The promised alternative housing that the owner was supposed to provide never materialized, as far as I know. That was my first and last night working that kind of assignment. I requested a transfer to a different type of security work because I couldn't handle being involved in displacing vulnerable people like that. The whole thing still makes my skin crawl when I think about it, even all these years later. I've been working as a security guard for the past 8 years now, and for my first 5 years in the industry, I was stationed at this really old manufacturing plant. We're talking about a facility that was built sometime around 1910 or 1915. So it was well over a century old when I started working there. The place had this incredibly rich industrial history that you could feel in every brick and steel beam. It had originally been built as a textile mill back when this part of Pennsylvania was the heart of American manufacturing. And over the decades, it had been converted and reconverted for various industrial purposes. By the time I started working there, it was being used as a distribution center for automotive parts, but you could still see remnants of its previous incarnations everywhere you looked. The building itself was absolutely massive. We're talking about a structure that covered probably 6 or 7 city blocks, with multiple levels, and these incredibly high ceilings that must have been 30 or 40 feet tall in some sections. The architecture was that classic early 20th century industrial style, with these huge windows that had been designed to let in as much natural light as possible back in the days before electric lighting, was really practical for large-scale manufacturing. Most of those windows were either boarded up or painted over by the time I worked there, which meant that during the night shift, when all the overhead lighting was turned off to save on electricity costs, the place became this labyrinth of shadows and dim emergency lighting that created an atmosphere you'd expect to find in a horror movie. The company I worked for had gotten the contract to provide overnight security for the facility. And since it was such a huge space with so many potential entry points, they usually had 2 guards on duty at any given time. During my 5 years there, I was partnered with various different people, but for most of that time, I worked with this guy named Eddie, who had been doing security work for probably 15 or 20 years and really knew his stuff. Eddie was the kind of guy who took the job seriously, but wasn't overly paranoid about things. He understood that 99% of the time, nothing was going to happen, but he also knew how to spot the signs when something wasn't quite right. He taught me a lot about reading situations, trusting your instincts, and understanding the difference between normal building noises and sounds that might indicate a problem. The facility had this complex layout that had evolved over decades of renovations and modifications. There were main corridors that ran the length of the building, but there were also all these smaller side passages and storage areas that had been added on over the years as the company's needs changed. Some sections of the building were completely unused and had been essentially abandoned for years, which created these dead zones where you might not see another human being for months at a time. Our primary responsibility was to do hourly patrol rounds through the main areas of the facility, checking doors and windows, making sure all the security systems were functioning properly, and generally just maintaining a visible presence in case anyone was thinking about trying to break in. The company stored millions of dollars worth of automotive parts in there, so theft was definitely a legitimate concern. But the real challenge of working in a place like that wasn't dealing with potential burglars. It was dealing with the psychological effects of spending 8 hours a night in this massive, mostly empty building that had been accumulating history and atmosphere for over 100 years. There's something about old industrial buildings that gets into your head, especially when you're walking through them alone in the middle of the night with nothing but the sound of your footsteps echoing off the walls. During my time working there were exactly 2 incidents that really stick out in my memory as being genuinely unsettling and inexplicable. Both of them happened during my 3rd year on the job. when I thought I had gotten completely comfortable with the building and its various quirks and characteristics. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night in October. I remember it being October because we had just switched back from daylight saving time, so it was getting dark much earlier than it had been just a week before. Eddie and I had settled into our usual routine. He would handle the eastern sections of the building, while I covered the western sections, and we'd meet back at the main security office every hour to check in with each other and document our rounds. I was maybe 3 years into working at this facility by that point, so I knew every inch of the place like the back of my hand. I could navigate through the building in complete darkness if I had to, and I was familiar with all the normal sounds. The way the old heating system would kick on and off, the way certain doors would creak when the building shifted slightly due to temperature changes, the way the wind would whistle through some of the broken windows in the abandoned sections. So when something was genuinely out of the ordinary, I could usually tell right away. On this particular night, I was making my regular patrol through the western corridor, which was the main thoroughfare that connected all the different departments in that section of the building. It was probably around 1:30 in the morning, and everything had been completely normal up to that point. As I approached the back corner of the building, where there was a door that led out to a loading dock area that wasn't used anymore, I started to notice that the lighting in that area seemed different than usual. The emergency lighting system was supposed to provide just enough illumination to meet safety requirements, but it wasn't supposed to be bright enough to actually work by or anything like that. But as I got closer to that back door, it seemed like there was more light coming from that direction than there should have been. My first thought was that maybe someone had left one of the overhead light switches on in that area, even though that would have been against company policy during the overnight hours. But as I continued walking toward the door, I realized that the extra light wasn't coming from inside the building at all. It was coming from outside, through the windows and under the door. This was strange because the loading dock area was surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings, so there shouldn't have been any significant light sources out there. I got to within maybe 40 feet of the door, and that's when I realized that not only was there extra light coming from outside, but the quality of the light was wrong somehow. It wasn't the yellow-orange color you'd expect from street lights, or the blue-white color you'd get from security floodlights. It was more like natural daylight, but that was obviously impossible at 1:30 in the morning. And then, just as I was trying to process what I was seeing, all the lights in that area went completely out. Not just the extra light that had been coming from outside, but also the emergency lighting that was supposed to stay on at all times. Suddenly, I was standing in absolute, complete darkness. Now, I've been in dark places before, but this was different. This wasn't just the absence of light. This was like being inside a cave or a sealed room where absolutely no light could penetrate from any direction. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't make out any shapes or shadows, couldn't even see the faint glow from the exit signs that should have been visible from where I was standing. My first instinct was to reach for my flashlight, but for some reason, and I still can't explain this, my entire body just froze. It was like every muscle in my body had suddenly stopped responding to my brain's commands. I was just standing there in this complete darkness, unable to move, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. I don't know how long I stood there like that. It could have been 30 seconds. It could have been 5 minutes. Time seemed to have stopped working normally. But gradually, I became aware that I wasn't alone in that darkness. There was something else there with me. Something that I couldn't see or hear, but that I could definitely sense. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was just present, like when you're in a room with another person and you can feel their presence even if you can't see them or hear them moving around. Except this presence didn't feel entirely human. Eventually, the emergency lighting flickered back on, and I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd been when the lights went out. Everything looked completely normal, the same old industrial corridor, the same worn concrete floors, the same metal doors and windows that I'd been looking at just minutes before. But I couldn't bring myself to walk the rest of the way to that back door. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get out of that area as quickly as possible. So that's exactly what I did. I turned around and walked back toward the main part of the building, and I didn't return to that section for the rest of my shift. When I met up with Eddie at the security office an hour later, I tried to explain what had happened, but I could tell he thought I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. He suggested that maybe there had been a car with its headlights on in the parking lot of one of the nearby businesses, and maybe there had been a temporary power fluctuation that affected the emergency lighting system. His explanations made logical sense, but they didn't account for the feeling I'd had of not being alone in that darkness, or the complete physical paralysis that had prevented me from moving or reaching for my flashlight. I'd never experienced anything like that before, and I hoped I never would again. But unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. The second incident happened about 6 weeks later, during the week between Christmas and New Year's Day. Most of the regular day shift workers were on vacation, so the building was even emptier than usual during the daytime. And at night, it felt like Eddie and I were the only people for miles around. I had been trying to avoid that back corridor where the first incident had occurred, but on this particular night, Eddie had called in sick, so I was working alone and had to cover the entire building by myself. Company policy required that all areas be checked during every patrol round, so I couldn't just skip that section indefinitely. It was probably around 3 in the morning when I finally worked up the courage to head back toward that area. I had my flashlight ready this time, and I'd made sure to test all the lighting systems before starting my rounds. Everything seemed to be working normally. As I approached the back section of the building, I was relieved to see that the lighting looked completely normal. Just the usual dim emergency lighting. No strange extra illumination coming from outside. No unusual colors or shadows. I was starting to think that maybe Eddie had been right about the first incident being explainable by normal causes. But as I got closer to the main corridor that led to the back door, I started hearing something that definitely wasn't normal. It sounded like footsteps, not the heavy work boots that security guards wear, but lighter footsteps, like someone wearing regular shoes or maybe even dress shoes. At first, I thought maybe Eddie had decided to come in to work after all, even though he'd called in sick. Sometimes people do that when they start feeling better, especially if they need the money. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that the footsteps weren't coming from the direction of the main entrance, where Eddie would have come in. They were coming from deeper in the building, from areas that should have been completely empty. And they weren't following the pattern you'd expect from a security guard doing patrol rounds. They were irregular, sometimes stopping for long periods, sometimes moving quickly, sometimes seeming to change direction randomly. I tried calling out, "Eddie, is that you?" But I didn't get any response. I tried using my radio to contact him, but all I got was static. Then I tried calling the main security office to see if they had any record of additional personnel being sent to the facility. But my cell phone wasn't getting any signal, which was strange, because I usually had pretty good reception in most parts of the building. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes getting closer to where I was standing, sometimes moving away. I tried following them a couple of times, but every time I thought I was getting close to the source, the sounds would stop completely, and then start up again somewhere else entirely. Eventually, I decided that the safest thing to do would be to return to the main security office and wait until my shift was over. I'd never encountered anything I couldn't handle before, but this situation was beyond my comfort zone, and I didn't want to take any unnecessary risks while working alone. As I was walking back toward the front of the building, I passed by one of the offices that had a window overlooking the main corridor. Out of habit, I glanced through the window to make sure everything looked normal in that area. And that's when I saw something that I still have trouble believing, even all these years later. There was someone walking down the corridor. Not Eddie, not anyone I recognized, but definitely a human figure. It was a man, probably middle-aged, wearing what looked like a dark suit or business attire. He was walking at a normal pace, not trying to hide or sneak around, just walking down the corridor like he belonged there. But here's the thing that really disturbed me. He wasn't casting a shadow. The emergency lighting was creating shadows from all the normal objects in the corridor: door frames, fire extinguishers, support pillars. But this person walking through the area wasn't creating any shadow at all. I watched him for maybe 30 or 40 seconds as he walked the length of the corridor, and then turned a corner and disappeared from view. I immediately ran to the security office and started reviewing the camera footage from that area. But when I checked the recordings, there was nothing there. The cameras showed the empty corridor, with nobody walking through it. I spent the rest of my shift in the security office, monitoring all the camera feeds and trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't my imagination or a trick of the lighting or anything that could be explained by normal causes. The next day, I did some research into the history of the building, and I discovered some interesting information that I hadn't known before. Apparently, back in the 1930s, there had been a serious industrial accident at the facility when it was still being used as a textile mill. Several workers had been killed when a section of machinery had malfunctioned and caused a partial collapse of one of the upper floors. According to the newspaper accounts I found, one of the victims had been a supervisor named Harold Mitchell, who had been wearing a business suit because he'd been meeting with company executives that day when the accident occurred. His body had been found in almost exactly the same area where I'd seen the figure walking down the corridor. I never reported either of these incidents to my supervisors because I knew they'd either think I was crazy or they'd assume I was making excuses to avoid doing certain parts of my job. But I also never forgot them. and they definitely influenced my decision to eventually leave that position and find work at a different facility. Eddie came back to work the next week, and I tried to tell him about the second incident, but like before, he was skeptical about the whole thing. He suggested that maybe I'd seen the reflection of car headlights in the windows, or maybe there had been some kind of optical illusion created by the emergency lighting system. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't something that could be explained by conventional means. Working in that building had taught me that there are some places where the past doesn't stay in the past, where the events that happened decades ago continue to echo through the present in ways that most people would find impossible to believe. I finished out my contract at that facility, but I made sure to always work with a partner after that, and I never again volunteered to work alone in that building. Some places are just meant to be left alone, especially during the dark hours when the boundary between what's real and what's memory becomes thinner than it should be. I've since moved on to working at much newer, more modern facilities, but I still think about those 2 nights sometimes, especially when I'm working alone in dark, empty buildings. There's a part of me that wonders if what I experienced was unique to that particular facility, or if there are other old industrial buildings out there where similar things happen, but people just don't talk about them. Either way, I've learned to trust my instincts about places and situations that don't feel right, and I've never again let my curiosity override my common sense when it comes to investigating things that might be better left alone. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.